What's up, party people, and welcome to Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the upcoming release of World of Warcraft Classic. Well, didn't we get some interesting news in the last 24 hours? A long-awaited, meaty update from Blizzard about the content schedule coming in Classic, and you can bet that the Countdown listeners had something to say about it. And that's not all for today. It's a jam-packed episode. We've got Classic news analysis, we've got former WoW class designer Kevin Jordan back on the show to go break down the design philosophy of warriors, and then we finish up with an awesome trip through AQ40 with a couple of vanilla raiders, which I really recommend you stick around for. This episode has it all. Now, you all know the drill by now. This is a community-based podcast, so if you like what you're hearing, please join the Discord and keep the conversations going with us all over there. Follow the show on social media and also email me at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com if you'd like to call into the show, make a suggestion, or just say hi. Everything you'll need is in the show notes for each episode, along with the show's Patreon link if you'd like to help keep the show going. Or if subscriptions aren't your thing, then you can help keep the lights on at Countdown by shopping at the Countdown to Classic merch store if you're looking for t-shirts, coffee mugs, stuff like that to help show your love for Classic and the show. But for now, let's get straight into it and start up with Calling Countdown. Alright, it's time for another Countdown to Classic call, and we've got an emergency call happening at the moment. It's 6 o'clock in the morning in Australia. I just woke up an hour ago to, get my day started, get ready to go back to work after being in bed with the flu all weekend. And I woke up to some amazing news, and I'm presuming that all of you got hit with this news through your day as well. We got a rather significant update with Classic, and it's the update that we've actually been waiting for. I know we got a little bit of an update about 6-7 days ago. I didn't personally categorize that as really newsworthy. That's why you didn't hear me talk about it on the show. I felt like Blizzard was just telling us, hey, we're working on it. So I didn't really feel like that message was worth rehashing on the show. I know a lot of people lost their minds over it, but this is the one that I've been waiting for. This is the one that I'm happy to start losing our collective shit over. So I've rounded up some emergency listeners to give our thoughts, and we've got the always reliable, the always amazing Taladril. How are you, mate?
Hey.
And we've also got a bit of a reunion, which is funny because you guys haven't heard the call that they did before. It's coming on the show later, but these guys have spoken together before. Axtel, how's things, mate?
Things are good. I just finished the episode with 1927 today, so thanks for having me back.
Mate, my pleasure. And a Countdown to Classic first-timer. It wouldn't be a Countdown to Classic episode unless we had a first-timer on here. Sonosuke, thanks so much for joining in, mate. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. I'm excited about this.
Fantastic, man. I'm excited to get stuck into it. So, you know what? Let's not beat around the bush. Let's just fucking do it. Taladril, I'll start with you. Wow, they obviously showed that they listened. Now, this wasn't a drastic bomb for me. I really had presumed, and I'd heard a couple of things that the Classic team was very much so listening to the community. So I wasn't as concerned about that as some others were when they're fire and brimstone. Do they even fucking care about us? Do they even listen to us? I knew they were listening to us. So hearing this was amazing to know that they actually changed that plan, even though I knew they were taking the feedback on board. What do you think about the move from 4 phases to 6, and what are the ramifications for the community?
I think it's pretty good. I would change some slight things. Personally, I would probably do 7 phases, but I like it. I like how they've got a good mix of 40 mans and 20 mans sort of at the same time, that kind of thing. Like, I really like how Zolgurub and Green Dragons is the same phase. That makes a lot of sense. I'm really happy that Green Dragons is not at the same time as AQ, because then that really delegitimizes them. So that's really nice to see. Personally, I know it would have been a changes thing. I would have liked to see tier 0.5 moved up a bit, because it's sort of pointless by the time it comes out, but that's okay. My biggest beef, honestly, with this at this point, minus whatever they'd say with PvP, is I really don't want to see raids open at launch. I want it to just be a leveling process, but I know that's probably an unpopular opinion.
Well, that would, I mean, forgive my ignorance, but I mean, Molten Core and Onyxia were available on launch back in the day. Is that right?
Yes, they were, but when people were playing back in the day, nobody was rushing to do that content. So that's the difference.
It's an interesting tweak for sure. I'm sure. I mean, I know you appreciate that a lot of people might be against you on that one, but as we say, we're more than happy to live in hypothetical land here. Sonosuke, I'll move on to you now to piggyback off of what Taladril has said. I'll chip in with a little bit of information of mine. Now, I feel foolish as per usual because I didn't realize the significance of the placement of the green dragons that Taladril has just pointed out, and in terms of the nature resist gear and the placement of Anchorage as well. I feel like, I mean, people may have been mentioning this, and I feel silly because I'm like, why wasn't I picking up on this in the forums? I feel like that part of it wasn't getting talked about enough, and we were all focusing on Dire Maul. But what did you think of everything in general?
As far as this goes, as someone who played through all this content originally, I love what they're doing with the phases. I think moving Green Dragons away from AQ is better, because a lot of gear, even like the BIS pieces, like the Paladin Helm of Thon or something like that, gets trivialized a lot with AQ drops from the 40 man. The other thing is having ZG split from Blackwing Lair is huge, because if you have ZG and Blackwing Lair same day, it trivializes all of Blackwing Lair because of Bloodvine and things like that. And the other aspect is moving Dire Maul away from Molten Core turns Molten Core from being a joke to more of a dad joke. So I'm really liking the move of Dire Maul away from Molten Core.
Very good.
A dad joke. No, I like that.
I love it. His first call and hitting them out of the park already. All right. Now, Axtel, you got to follow that one up, mate. I hope you got a good joke of your own. But let's talk about how, maybe just focus on that first big point that I think stands out like the proverbial red dog's balls to everyone, which is they've shifted Dire Maul down to phase 2 away from Molten Core. Tell me about what that means to you personally as someone who's diving in hard on World of Warcraft Classic.
For me, that's going to be from listening to your show. Know that there's a lot of itemization that makes Molten Core a lot easier. People kind of count on it, and it makes some items not even worth getting anymore or farming for in Molten Core if you can get them through Dire Maul. Also, doesn't it affect the economy a little bit? If you don't have Dire Maul available, that's kind of one of the number one dungeons to farm to gather gold quickly, isn't it? So
it depends on how you look at it. It depends on how you look at it, because as a listener raised recently, and I really have to go back and re-listen to that episode because I know it's one of the show's more popular episodes. I think, and please someone tell me if I'm wrong here, I believe Party Pooper raised a decent argument for the reasons in which why Dire Maul farming does not actually affect the economy. It's sort of its own bubble in a way. Now I know that. I don't see strange.
Disagree with that.
Okay, great. Go for it. Tell me your thoughts.
The problem with Dire Maul specifically for hunter farming, it's not that it's just a bunch of herbs getting injected in the economy. It's pure gold. So in that sense, that specific increases the speed of inflation. So that's why hunter farming Dire Maul is very negative, I would say, to the economy, because it is just pure gold added. Dire Maul East, where it's a lot more just herb based, that's not, in my opinion, nearly as bad.
Okay. Now, Taladril, I'll get you to sort of keep running with the ball a little bit. Outside of that Dire Maul sort of separation that we've gotten, the next thing that stands out is, I believe, Azugos and Kazakh were moved as well. They were in phase 1 before, is that right?
Were they? I don't remember. It wouldn't surprise
either.
me though. Yeah. I mean, they don't have a lot of specific gear, but it's nice to see them just separate. It's, having something new for the 40-mans to do, to me, is sort of the goal. You can see a 40-man for every single stage here, and that's a real bonus. But yeah, they don't have huge gear issues, so they're not they weren't really, in my opinion, that big of a deal. And honestly, Dire Maul wasn't even that big of a deal to me too. I'm glad, and maybe we'll get back into this later, but I'm really glad that they are being careful with the 1.10 dungeon blues, separating them out, because they were way more powerful than anything that Dire Maul would bring out. And initially it didn't sound like they were going to care about those items, and that would have been a really big problem.
Now, it was initially in phase 1. I just double checked. So it was Kazakh and Azygos were in that stage 1 of 4 that they had planned earlier, along with Molten Core, Onyxia, and Dire Maul, and obviously they've split them up now. Sonosuke, I'll turn to you, and the next point I wanted to sort of openly wonder about was, I wasn't a big Dark Moon Fair guy at all. I know next to nothing about the Dark Moon Fair. I mean, I know about the deck. I know about, some of the buffs it gives and all that jazz, and some of the things you can do with it, the things that you can equip. And, I'm sure there's no doubt it's beneficial to you to go through that trawl of having to fucking collect the deck. But tell me if you're not particularly well versed with it. Maybe one of the other guys is, but what does the Dark Moon Fair finally being talked about in the phase release do for you? Because I know that in the initial BlizzCon plan, it wasn't even mentioned, but now we've got mention of it. So talk about that for a little bit if you can.
Yeah, I'm curious as to why they actually have it put on there as opposed to actually talking about PvP, which is a much larger issue. But as far as the Dark Moon Fair goes, all the trinkets, when they first came out, everyone was all about those trinkets. Like, I collected them. I had all of them but one of them, I think, which was I even got the res trinket, yeah. So, I had all the trinkets on several of my 60s. The main thing about the Dark Moon Fair is the Beast deck is going to be massive for top-end guilds. So you're going to see a lot of Ubers farming. It's going to bring back some of those older dungeons that people are maybe stopping to do because everyone's going to be farming Dire Maul and stuff. They're going to be like, oh, I guess we better go back to Ubers and farm Beast and stuff like that. And then what it's going to do is it's going to also kind of change itemization for BWL and stuff. So like people who might not get the rejuvenating gem or have to wait on some of those items can just get the Beast deck as a healer at least, and they'll be good for that. Other classes will try to get the damage trinket, play around on PvP with that a little bit, and then save it for Naxxramas. So it'll be pretty interesting, I think.
Axtel, Sonosuke just mentioned the elephant in the room, which is PvP, not mentioned anywhere. This is what's got a lot of people scratching their heads, and it definitely does raise an eyebrow for me too. Where do you think they are considering placing PvP? Surely I'm looking right around that phase 2 part, but, we don't know how long it is between phases or whatnot. What do you think about why they didn't place PvP anywhere? Do you think it's much more of a bigger issue than we seem to think it is?
I think the gear that comes out of those that are going to push the rewards from the PvP system is going to could be detrimental, not really detrimental, but could be bad towards when Blackwing Lair comes out. I know that other content creators have already pushed out videos talking about how they haven't addressed PvP yet, and the only place makes sense is probably in the early or mid phase 2. If they wait till the end of phase 2 or the beginning of phase 3 and later, then it's going to be bad for the content that comes out in the later phases. And they obviously care about, the player power progressive content, or else they wanted to split the 4 phases into 6 anyways. So if I were a betting man, I would say phase 2, the middle or beginning of phase 2 is when it will come out, or even a whole new phase, as Taladril mentioned at the beginning of the call, like a 7th phase that'll fit in between 2 and 3.
Why would you think that phase 3 would be too late? I'm curious.
I had mentioned that some of the Grand Marshal or Warlord weapons or gear could be compared to the Blackwing Lair gear as far as
Well, they got an update at the AQ level, which would put them up to about AQ level of purples. So that's why that's to me why I would think definitely phase 2 or phase 3, but I think phase 3 would not be too late.
Part of me almost thinks that they're going to release 2 of the battlegrounds and then save the 3rd one for a different phase. Like, that's almost that's the vibe I'm getting. So I think it's going to be that, and I think 2 will probably get released in phase 2 and 1 will get released in phase 3.
That'd be cool.
Do any of you find it surprising, and this is open to sort of first in best dressed here, do any of you find it surprising that there's perhaps a lot more thought going into this than we previously had considered ourselves, in terms of the fact that we've been highlighting this summer 2019 release date. Here we are, and in Australia, it's fucking March 12. And summer is not that far away. You know, we talk about winter is coming. Well, fucking summer is coming. And here we are with key decisions still being made or not decided upon. Does that shock any of you?
You want my jaded opinion?
Go for it.
I'm pretty surprised they're actually listening to the community this much, because if you look at retail, they certainly don't listen to anybody over there. The fact that there are devs that are truly locking in and reading forums, listening to podcasts maybe, yeah, that's pretty surprising to me.
Allegedly listening to this podcast. Sorry, go for it, mate.
Allegedly.
Yeah, I think that with the classic team, we're gonna have that vibe from the devs, because when they announced the project, they hired for this project. I feel like the people that are the devs on retail, they maybe got hired, I don't know, 5 years ago working on a project that they maybe were a lot more passionate about, and now the company's, you know, it's hard to work somewhere that you absolutely hate doing the work you're doing. So it's probably a lot easier for the classic guys that signed up to do this to read the forums and you go take the fight to the table and get what they need to get done.
Now, Taladril, I'll kick back with you to start this one off, and then I might turn to you, Sonosuke, to piggyback off of what Taladril says. But outside of, you know, the meat of the post, which is obviously these 6 phases that we've been told about, there's actually another considerable meaty little tidbit dropped in there, which they explain a little bit, which is, for all intents and purposes, seeming to be a conversation about progressive itemization. Now, I don't think they're being particularly subtle about it. I think they're basically saying, sorry about my cat. He's going nuts. He's very excited about WoW Classic news. There we go. All right. Progressive itemization coming in terms of pre 1.10 patches and whatnot. Taladril, what did this mean to you? Did it make your heart fly going, yes, progressive itemization, which we've talked about a lot on the show before?
Right. So there were a bunch of things that were added in 1.10, and I think some things added in 1.11 too. So there's definitely a question mark of where some of these things will fit. You know, some of them will possibly be earlier, some of them will be later, but it's nice to see. A lot of that stuff was considered catch-up gear, and so Blizzard they weren't, you know, if they were looking back in the day, they probably wouldn't have done this, but they weren't very careful in the sense where it's like, okay, we'll just throw a bunch of these really powerful blues into these random dungeons, and it allowed people who were new to the game to be able to pick up some gear and be raid viable, you know. So those pieces of gear are crazy strong. They're better than Molten Core gear. They're better than even some Blackwing Lair gear, and certainly ZG. So to be able to have some of that gear locked away is really good. And, you know, like Titanic leggings, those things are so strong. That was one thing they mentioned, and those are craftable, and if they were just be available at the beginning of the game as a craftable thing, it would just be way too strong.
Sonosuke, anything you've got to pick up on from there?
Yeah, definitely. Like, the progressive itemization is something that a lot of us who are more of the no changes crowd have been wanting, so that's really good to see. I am blown away that they actually listened and moved Dire Maul away. And so the fact that it looks like they're doing progressive itemization as well, tells me that they're not listening to the retail folks. They're actually listening to the people who played the original game, or at least have insight on the original game because of private servers. And that's a really good thing in terms of keeping it. It's not going to be the same as it was back then, but it's closer now than it was before. And that's a really good thing to see. And I really appreciate that they're actually listening and they're doing that. And again, it all comes back to the PvP itemization too. How does that progress? And so they're going to have to make another blue post about just all PvP stuff, but I'm excited so far.
Axtel, you mentioned to me before we started the call, you might be a bit like me. I'm presuming you know more than me, because most people do, but you suggested that you might be a little bit of a noob when it comes to progressive itemization, not quite the guru in that regard, but that's the same as me. Now, what I'm interested in asking you is, are you basically of the mindset that this stuff doesn't particularly bother you, and, you know, I'm sure people who, you know, get paid to look at this, and the players who invest much more time than we do in the game will work it all out and tell us what we need to hear? Or are you actually going to be pushed to research this a bit more and find out why progressive itemization that is now coming to you in WoW Classic is important to you?
Yes. In the middle. When I first started WoW, I had already started I just started when the 0.5 tier was the thing. So for me, vanilla, is leveling up and then trying to get your 0.5 gear set and then getting into raids, when in actuality that is not the timeline. Now that I'm older and I still have some time to play the game, I do plan on pushing pretty hard, but I am not pushing for a realm or world first at all. So as far as the itemization, it doesn't bother me, but I'm researching it and getting more familiar with it so that I can better my character and help out whichever guild my friends and I decide to join once the release comes out. But it's something that I honestly didn't even know really existed until I started getting really into your show. So it's definitely something to research.
Okay. Taladril, I'll turn back to you, and something's just come up in Twitch chat from listener Neil, who we love like a son here on the show, obviously has been on before, and who works in the gaming industry, so I definitely put a bit of weight behind his opinion. But I'd love to get your comment on what he said, where he suggests that he thinks that we're getting item gating instead of progressive itemization. And he says that as a game dev, PO, from his point of view, it makes a lot more sense for the rollout and transparency of gaming systems. Do you agree with that, or would you somewhat disagree with that?
No, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, call it whatever you want to. I mean, I think that he's right in the sense, like, it's that the gear comes out when the patch says it should. What a lot of people talk about when they mean by gear itemization changing is that the literal stats on gear changes. And to me, from like a game enjoyment standpoint, it's just so confusing and weird, so to have that be a set thing and to have it never change, but to just simply have it be available or not available, that's definitely the right way to do that.
Sonosuke, do you feel the same way about that point? Do you feel it's just like a little bit of a decoration of a different concept, that they are actually just pushing these items back a little bit behind a gate and dressing it up as something else?
To a degree, but I think that a lot of it is, in the end, is not going to matter as much. I think that most of the stuff is going to be gated, and I would probably use gated as more of the actual term. But the other thing, I don't know, the PvP gear, that's what I want to see, is we'll know for sure how they're doing itemization as soon as they tell us what they're doing with PvP gear. That's like the most important thing. Cause a lot of
that's
PvP
the biggie.
gear, yeah, it can also affect the PvE gear, because when you look at especially with the GM weapons, those matter a lot. So that's the most important thing for me to see now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they get a big boost. So if they stick with the original numbers, then you could release it earlier and it would be okay. But if they stick with the one-time numbers, the last numbers, then you need to wait a little bit because they're so powerful. They can overpower other gear by quite a bit because of that.
Yeah, you don't want to trivialize all of the raid content because of like a PvP item. Like that's really...
All right, guys, look, I've got to get to work soon, so I've only got about 5 or so more minutes left for the call. I do apologize. We could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, real life is getting in the way, but I want to wind up this call by doing the following. I just want to get your sort of free flow thoughts on the news in general. Say whatever the hell you want, and I'll kick us off and just sort of leave it open to the crowd, and whether it goes another 5, 6, 7 minutes, whatever, that's fine. But obviously, this is amazing news. This is the kind of positive, really substantial news that we've been waiting for. As I said at the top of the show, a lot of what we've heard lately has not been scratching the itch in the way that I've been wanting. And I know that people lose their fucking minds whenever they see blue text. I am not cut from that cloth. I'm a bit of a pessimist that way. I apologize to people, but when I want news, I want it to be news. And so this is that. And I'm really happy, but what I'm wondering now is like, what more we'll get. And I think we're going to get a lot more of this very, very soon. People have been predicting a little bit of a waterfall of classic news very soon. And it's not a big stretch to make because obviously we're fucking running out of time. Like I keep saying, summer is just around the corner. There's only, like people say, 3, 4, 5 months away. But I mean, not to sound too silly, but we're talking about anywhere between 12 to 20 weeks until Classic. Like, it's not that long. So the news has to come eventually. So I'll open it up to the floor, guys. How did you react to this? What do you think it means for us going forward?
I love this post. I knew there was a post coming soon. I knew it was going to be sometime this month. I didn't know exactly when. I was hoping before the 20th, and we got it today, which is great. The most important thing to me, what they did is, every one of these moves they've made has been to avoid trivializing content. And that's so important to me when it comes to Classic, because I'm a huge PvEer. I focus very much on that. And having all these other content drops at the same time as the main 40-man raids trivializes so much stuff that it would be like such a shell of a game. So having it not be trivialized as much is huge for me. And then also, one thing to note is, since Maraudon is going to be out when release happens, something like Thrashblade is going to be a very sought after item. And it's going to be, you'll probably see a lot of people running that. And I'm super glad about that Thrashblade, Dalrens, things like that are going to be the main weapons of choice. And it's not going to be PvP weapons or other shenanigans.
Yeah, I agree with all that for sure, too. I like where they're going with this. Although this is simply one aspect, I'd really like to see what their thoughts are for, like, world buffs. Like, for me, I'd hope that they would remove them, but it would be nice for them to at least talk about what their plans are for them, because they really do trivialize content. And then also just to... Oh, I forgot my point. Continue on. I'll come back.
All right, it's all good. So we'll circle back around. Axtel, anything?
So, for me, since I think in this call I'm right there with Josh, where I don't have as much expertise as Taladril and Sonosuke, but when I see a blue post, I'm one of those people where, like, I will almost pull off the road to look at it if I see it, or if I get a notification, but then I usually get, like, somewhat disappointed because I've been waiting for so long now for just a date, even a date that says, here's your beta. So with all this blue information is great, and I can enjoy the happiness that the community gets from it and are excited that they're listening and going in the direction they want. But at the same time, I'm like, damn, we got that close and there's still no date listed on the post, but they'll release it when they're ready. And,
you sound like you'd be like my poor co-host of the Cinephiles, Liam, who hugs random strangers in the street at the sight of good news. So we got it. We got classic news. All right, buddy, just get off me.
When I do see a release date, it's going to be quite a good day. There's probably nothing's going to hold me down that day.
Just openly weeping. Taladril, how'd you go, man? Did you circle back around?
Yes, I did think of it.
All
yeah,
right.
So I was going to say, I want to see what they're going to do specifically for Molten Core in terms of raid balancing, because I would think that they're going to need to do this in some way, just because they're releasing the game with 1.12 talents, and that is a huge thing. I would hope that they're going to do something at least for Molten Core to make it harder. So I'd be curious to see what they're going to say about that.
All right, guys. Well, look, I do have to run. We've gone almost half an hour. That's about it. Unless anyone has anything really important that they feel we haven't touched on, speak now or forever hold your silence. Anyone?
I would just say the last thing that I'm looking forward to is seeing exactly how the patches progress. So what's the key to
timeline wise? Yeah.
Oh yeah, we got to get that news.
I hope they don't speed through it too much with just a couple months between them, because there's plenty of time to.
Yeah, the old 3 weeks between phases.
Yeah, definitely no.
Yeah, that's the next thing to know, and obviously something that they're still working on. So that adds to sort of my point of just being, it's a bit funny how we don't have that much time left, and not saying they owe us this news, but to not be saying, hey, these phases will come X amount of weeks or months apart. Like, whether it's 8 weeks apart or 4 months apart or 6 months apart, I don't know. But to not give us that now, just, it's not odd, but it's like, I mean, you could have. How do you not know that yet? But anyway, I mean, they've still got a lot to work out, so fine. But anyway, guys, I'll leave it there. Sort of, we've got much more to talk about this later down the track, I'm sure, and I'm sure we'll get more news by the time we're done talking about this. But thanks so much to all of you for jumping on. I know I put the bat signal up at the last second. You all answered the call. I'm so, happy to have listeners like you who come on at the drop of a hat with such insightful analysis. And thanks so much, and I'll speak to you all later.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Good day at work. Good luck.
Thanks, Josh.
Cheers, guys. Bye. Recently, on my other podcast, The Cinephiles, we covered 1992's Scent of a Woman.
You could have at least let me watch you fuck that prostitute.
I'm not blind.
What? Jeez,
yeah, so we don't need to waste it.
Jeez, mister, I would have just sat in the corner. I wouldn't have said nothing.
How about this? You got me to describe every other woman to you in the movie except the naked one.
She looks like she's enjoying it.
Yeah.
She looks like she's enjoying it.
Yep.
Actually, she's shaking her head. She's looking at me and shaking it. Oh, I think she's telling me to lie.
There's a track mark on her left arm.
Frank. That's a man.
Hooah. Hooah.
If you'd like to hear more from the Cinephiles, then please do log on to cinephiles.com. That's SINNERFILES. Or search for the Cinephiles on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. But now, let's get back to Countdown. Okay, it's time for the first installment of a very special Countdown to Classics segment, one that you'll only find here on the show that I'm very happy to bring to you. We've got the one, the only, Kevin Jordan, one of the original class designers on World of Warcraft. He's spoken on the show before. A lot of you really enjoyed that chat with Kevin. Whenever his name is invoked in the Discord, we get a lot of Kevin Jordan, he's a cool guy. You should get him back. So we're so glad he's back here now. Kevin, how are you, mate?
Doing well. How are you? I didn't realize I was a cool guy. That's a different thing.
You're a cool guy. It reminds me of that moment in Zoolander when, obviously they say to Derek, you should listen to your friend Billy Zane. He's a cool guy. So I get a lot of, you should listen to Kevin Jordan. He's a cool guy. So I'm like,
That's amazing.
Absolutely. So I'm so glad you're back. Now, what we're going to be doing and what you've graciously agreed to is to go through each class in the game week by week in about a half-hour installment, just talking about specifically that class, things you were happy with in their design, things you weren't happy with, things you might change, things that you loved, things that you added, things that hit the cutting room floor, all of it. So we'll go through it. We'll add a few listener questions in. Now, obviously, if you don't know who Kevin is, I'll explain again. Kevin is one of the men that basically designed the class that you love, okay? He's one of the reasons that WoW is what it is. And Kevin is also actively streaming. So what I want you all to do now is I want you to go over to Twitch. I want you to follow him, and his username over there, or his handle, is Failure Analysis. Please go and listen to Kevin. He absolutely streams regularly. He talks about WoW occasionally. He does touch on things like game design and WoW's design during his streams. He's a really great source of information and a really nice, friendly chat as well while he's playing whatever he's playing at the moment. Kevin, I'll give you a chance. Please tell people a bit more about your stream.
Thanks. Thanks for the plug. So essentially the channel is about playing games, and it's also about talking about game design. Never a stream goes by where we don't end up talking about WoW to some extent, regardless of what I'm playing, because that's obviously a lot of my history. I also worked on Tyranny, for those of you who know that game, from Obsidian Entertainment. And I worked on Hex Shards of Fate from Cryptozoic. It's a digital TCG. So those are sort of the three big games that I've worked on in the past, and that's where a lot of the questions come from, or, what various details about those games and just game design in general. So yeah, come by, say hello, hang out, and chat with me sometime.
Fantastic. And I'll be encouraging everyone through the Discord as well. Please do go and help Kevin out. It really is a great time hanging out with him on stream. But what we'll do now is we'll touch on the first class that we wanted to go through. And I figured we'd get through a really popular one first, just to sort of scratch the backs of one of the larger, more used, obviously, classes in the game. And that's the class of Warrior. Now, what we're going to do is I've got a bit of a framework here for you for all these classes. We'll go through some generic questions. Anything that comes up through your answers, I'll follow up, but then we've got some listener questions as well at the end. So Kevin, I'll start you out with this, and let's just talk about Warriors in general. Were you happy or not overall with the Warrior class in vanilla?
Absolutely. I definitely consider Warrior to be one of the success stories. It has a strange history in MMOs and in tabletop RPGs. And I think that the translation from sort of the fighter class in Dungeons and Dragons, who was very aggressive, was a great source of DPS essentially, and very powerful, very intimidating. It brought together all of those sort of characteristics. But then once, tank, healer, DPS roles became established in MMOs, he gravitated towards the tank, and tank ultimately was supposed to absorb damage and mitigate damage, but not do a lot of damage. And I saw that as, sort of a departure from what I remember from old school RPG, being this aggressive damage dealing, the Conans of the world and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to try to get back to that. Not only that, but we had the history of Warcraft where, some of the most iconic characters were these aggressive, powerful warriors. They didn't just wear heavy armor and have a shield and hold things off. They got into the mix. They leapt in. They cleaved people in two, things like that. So wanted to bring some of that excitement back to the warrior, some of that aggressiveness and intimidation, but also fill the roles that were necessary in MMOs. So, and I think we did a good job. I think a lot of people really took to the aggressive side, the damage side of warriors, as well as being, obviously one of the best tanks early on. So all in all, I consider the warrior to be a success story.
Well, the next couple of questions I've got might be somewhat moot in terms of the warrior, because everyone's so aware of how strong the warrior is in vanilla WoW. And
right.
my question of, what specifically worked perhaps in terms of talent trees, well, we've got, Arms, Prot, Fury. I think it would probably be fair to suggest that all of them worked quite well. So all of those three trees, were you very, very happy with all of the sort of end results with them?
Yeah, I think, like the three flavors essentially of all the classes came down to the three specs, the three talent trees, and Arms of Protection came out of the gates really strong. Everyone knew you were going to need tanks for high-end content in dungeons. And so Prot was, always going to be popular. And Arms was sort of the new thing in terms of bringing that aggression and that damage back to the fighter class or warrior class. And then Fury was a different example of that, but it came out of the gates pretty slow. If you remember, a lot of people just counted it for a long time until that famous Indalamar video, which showed everyone essentially how good Fury could be. And then it sort of had its rise. And so I believed in it, but not a lot of people took to it immediately. So it was nice to see it come around and get the attention it deserved.
I'm really glad you brought up that video, because that's actually one of the listener questions that I got exactly about that in Dalamar video. So, I'll find the listener who asked this, but I've got exactly what they said, and I'll let you get your answer in, and then I'll shout out who it was. But they basically said, Can you ask Kevin about the original warrior design for Fury and how the video created by Indalamar in beta changed this? So I might sort of tweak that a bit and just also add, did you guys sort of gather around and watch that in the office and go, holy shit, what's going on here?
No, it wasn't a surprise to me. Like, it's one of those things where, perception and math don't always line up. Like, to me, the math was solid, the Fury Warrior, but the perception was it wasn't as good. And a lot of times it's because it's a different play style and it's more difficult to leverage the strength of the math, behind the play style. And that's exactly what Indalamar did. He basically just broke it apart and realized, well, this is the way you get performance out of this class. And he made a video showing it. And so it was a different style. Like, we wanted the Fury Warrior to be like ultra aggressive, sort of suicide DPS, if you will, just charges in and goes from fight to fight. Whereas Arms was a more like strategic DPS, in terms of like, you're more calm and you're more, balanced mentally sort of thing. That was sort of the concepts behind the two specs. And I think people just took to the easier math of the more straightforward play style of Arms. And it was really nice that Indalamar was able to pick it apart and show people how to do it essentially. And that's happened a few times in WoW's history, but that one came early and it really kind of turned the corner for the warrior class.
I must apologize, because that was regular contributor to the show, Ale, who asked that question. They actually followed up with this sort of add-on about that video again, saying, were you hired as a direct result of that video, or were you already an employee? And I guess what they're saying is, did Blizzard sort of take notice of what was happening with that particular class and go, shit, we need more people in here to really focus on the classes?
No, I was already there. If you're asking about me specifically, yeah, I had been there for a long time by the time that video came out. However, it did help Indalamar, who was actually Travis Day, get hired.
Oh, I didn't realize that was Travis Day. Okay.
Yeah. Travis Day and Indalamar are one and the same. And it makes sense once you realize it, because he had that mind as both an exceptional player and as a designer, to pick apart, the elements of a class and what it was going on. I remember when we hired Travis, we had our first meeting, or we had, sort of a lunch out with him. And as you can imagine, he was super excited to be there, and you couldn't stop him talking about WoW and about the warrior class. And he was just an old school, super geek and neckbeard for this stuff, which made him a great hire. But he was hitting me with some really hard hitting questions about the class and about, AP versus strength and, all kinds of stuff. I was like, wow, this guy has obviously put the work in and put the time in to really break it down and try to understand what's going on under the hood. And it was really exciting.
Okay, well, I might as well finish off Aile's sort of 3-part question because he just rounds it out with, were there any other times sort of similar to that you can recall that the community discovered unintended aspects of class design that you guys had to change or you were worried about?
For me, it was rarely a worry situation. I love emergent stuff. I love it when players take the thing that you've created and experiment with it and tear it apart and try to figure out the best thing. And conversely, it's probably one of the more frustrating aspects, like with the Fury Warrior before in Dalamar's video, is that not enough people in my mind were doing that, because I felt like the math behind Fury was good, but everyone was like, no, that spec is terrible. And it made me question everything, of course. But it was just sad to see that not enough people were really getting in there and trying to do it, trying to break it apart. So I love it when people break stuff apart and test the game in different ways. Is there a good example? I think the tri-spec on the Rogue is another good example. The most common specs were not, 3120 essentially. Most of them for the Rogue were a smattering of all three of the trees, which was super cool, I thought, but sort of unexpected as well.
Okay, well, I realize that the answer to this next question may have fluctuated somewhat through the lifespan of vanilla, but with warriors, what didn't work in terms of the talent trees? Obviously they got stronger as vanilla went along, but were there specific moments where you were really sitting around looking at each other going, this specific part of warriors is kind of broken, we have to do something?
In my mind, Mortal Strike was too iconic. Iconic's not the right word. It was too unique, I guess. I always felt like having that powerful ability to counteract healing for PvP was too important to have on just one class, essentially. And you saw how we added it to more classes later. The Troll had it as well, Troll Priest, but in a smaller, less powerful version. That was one thing I did think worked well. The other thing is sort of not specific to the warrior, but was sort of a problem with all non-DPS classes, in that as the prot warrior or as a healing spec, it was really difficult to level. It was really difficult and not very fun to just run around gaining XP and exploring the world and killing things and doing quests. So those specs were too specific to their role. And, the way the talent system works and the way games typically work and how you specialize everything, there was no way people were going to take DPS talents in the prot tree when they were trying to be the best tank in the world. So that was one thing that, didn't really work for the warrior. Forced that respec thing, which became really problematic and commonplace.
I feel like you're stopping short of using the term OP when talking about Mortal Strike.
Oh, right. It's certainly OP in terms of like its uniqueness. Mortal Strike, like against a non-healing class, was just another damaging ability. It was good, but it wasn't like game breaking. But in a lot of situations where in group PvP or against classes that relied on healing as part of their, dueling or soloing, it became really, really problematic.
Okay, so what specific abilities or talents did you particularly, or the team, love about warriors?
It had to be charge. Obviously a movement power. Movement powers are always really popular. They're very exciting. But it was also it was the perfect example of what we essentially wanted to do with the warrior that was different from what other MMOs had done in the past. And that is make him aggressive, make him the first in, make him travel. And it was exciting. It was just exciting to push that button, and it set the tone for everything else that followed, in that he was this guy that because if you remember from like EverQuest and other games, the warrior was not the puller typically. He was not the first in. You had like a range class doing the pulling, or a class that could feign death once it brought it back, things like that. So the warrior was there, and he would, pick up the mobs once they got to the room that you guys were camping, but he wasn't the first in. So, and nowadays that's the standard. The tank leads. The tank is the guy who's in the front of the group, deciding which rooms to go into, which rooms to pull, things like that. So I loved that transformation. That was really exciting. And a lot of that is embodied in the charge ability.
Well, Kevin, if it's okay with you, I might just ask, sorry mate to interrupt, that warrior I was hoping to get in on this call has just popped up. Do you mind if I just ask him if he's available for 10 to 15 minutes?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks, mate. 1 second. Hey, Docken, how are you, mate?
I'm doing all right. How are you, good sir?
I'm good. Now, mate, I've just been speaking with Kevin for about the last 10 to 15 minutes, and we've only got about another 15 minutes or so to go on the warrior call. But what I was hoping to do when I can on each of these calls is just get someone who plays the class sort of sitting in the background. So I'll still sort of be asking, a bunch of questions, but if Kevin says anything that makes you want to pipe up and delve a bit deeper that's specific to warriors and your knowledge of them, then please don't be shy. Okay, so I want to get through the bulk of what I want to get through, but like just to have you as sort of in the shadows, just sort of making sure that you're representing the warriors if something comes up, I think is a good idea.
Sounds good.
All right,
and
fantastic.
Just for the record, I've never met a shy warrior, so
I can imagine. All right, now where were we? I was about to ask you, Kevin. You just talked about charge being an ability that you loved in terms of maybe the class fantasy, the role that you wanted to play in the game. I really put charge right up there, and perhaps Docken would agree with and I've only dabbled with a lot of the classes up to about 30 odd. Rogue was my class, the only class I've taken to 60. But of all the classes that I've dabbled with, charge to me is still arguably the most satisfying ability to hit in the game. When you hit that button and you run right up, and it's just like you say, it's exactly how you wanted a warrior to feel. I really, really do enjoy it. Docken, do you feel the same way about the charge ability?
I think it's a very unique ability that does fit warriors very well. And if you do look at like the class fantasy of it and how it plays and that kind of thing, you're looking at that like, hey, I'm the warrior. I'm going to get in there. I'm just going to rush right in and, start kicking ass and be the first guy in. But even to follow up to that, one of the coolest things is like if you're in a situation where you're like even kind of dashing around mid combat using intercept, which is like another very strong ability with a similar mechanic to that, is a lot of enjoyment to me.
Yeah, that was, again, part of that breaking the mold mindset. Warriors and tanks of previous games had all been very slow, lumbering. They were easy to kite, in PvP. They just had no mobility. Their thing was just about taking damage and being a nuisance.
Yeah.
The last thing killed on the battlefield sort of thing. And so we wanted to break that mold. We wanted to bring some of that satisfying, aggressive play back to the warrior. So let him get some movement.
Now that we've heard about some of the abilities or talents that you loved, let's focus now a bit on the negative. Are there any abilities or talents that you wish you could change? And if so, how would you do it?
Gosh, that's a tough one. He was just so well rounded, and a lot of the features of the warrior were very natural. Like there were always more ideas that we had for the warrior than we actually put in, and a lot of that comes from the previous Warcraft games, especially Warcraft 3 with the different heroes, because you had the Tauren Chieftain, you had the Mountain King, you had the Blade Master, you had the Demon Hunter back when that was not its own class. And so all of the races and all, had their own different flavor of warrior. And much like the priests, we wanted to bring those abilities in so that people could feel like they were actually living the fantasy of some of the Warcraft heroes, but it didn't feel right as a generic ability for all warriors. And so we always had this huge set of abilities that were really specific to the race class combination of warrior, but we wanted to save for what we originally thought were hero classes back in the day, or potentially expansion classes. So most of the stuff that we could put in, we did. Yeah, it was always the sense of there were more cool things that we wanted to put in and didn't have yet than there were like, oh, this ability doesn't really feel good. Cause that's the trick with class design a lot of times is, you have a ton of ideas and you end up using the best ones. Each time you have opportunity to add something and, the bad stuff sort of hits the ground, the cutting room floor, as you said. We always had just a wealth of really cool ideas for the warrior.
I've been, dabbling myself in some more modern versions of WoW as of the last few days here. And one of the things that I have found that is amazingly entertaining to me, and I'm not advocating any changes by any means, but I love the heroic leap ability. I think it is the coolest thing that they put in for warrior. And I'm always just jumping around, even if it's for no real reason. But I think the mobility it offers is fantastic as well.
Yeah, that was after my era, and it was definitely from Diablo, the barbarian experience, and was extremely visceral in that game. And yeah, it was one of those things when I was working on the classes and we were making WoW, which I don't think is true anymore. I think they've gone a different direction, but we didn't want to step on the toes of Diablo. We didn't want to cross over because we had both products sort of under the Blizzard umbrella. And
I don't think they'll put WoW on phones, so we should be okay.
That's right.
Sorry.
Cause I remember seeing one of the first Diablo 3, internal demos and how difficult it was for me because they had come up with so many cool class stuff, abilities essentially, and how difficult it was for me not to steal the ideas and shove them into WoW before they could get their game out, But back in the day, it was no, we respect their space, they respect ours. And, so Heroic Leap was something that we let the Barbarian have and we did Charge instead. So that's some of the history of why not Heroic Leap.
Docken, are there any specific abilities that, you've played a boatload of vanilla now as a warrior, any specific talents or abilities that you feel are a little lackluster that you're wondering if Kevin can shine a light on as to something that didn't quite go far enough?
That's an interesting question.
Almost all the other classes, I feel like I have some go-tos, but.
Yeah, the warrior obviously
I know
sounds
Slam
great.
is one thing that a lot of people look at, and they I've heard very few uses of it that are efficient in high-end, optimized gameplay. I know that's something. I know there are some arguments about latency being a problem and weapons and different things like that, depending on how you gear up your character.
Yeah, Slam is actually a great one to bring up. It had a troubled life. Some people swear by it under certain builds with certain weapons in certain situations. But yeah, it was pretty narrow in its usability. But we love the idea of the telegraphed attack, even though the monsters don't really respond to telegraphed attacks. We love this idea that there would be this startup on the really powerful overhead swing, essentially. But yeah, that's a good example of one I don't think we actually pulled off. And a lot of that is just because it isn't that type of game. A lot of their games that use that mechanic are more actiony, and so there's a lot more dodging and mobility. Whereas in WoW, most things stand still when you're attacking them for the most part. So yeah, I don't think that one truly. There were definitely times where the numbers were solid and its use was possible, but yeah, as far as delivering that feel, I don't think we ever quite got there.
Kevin, are there any things that you suggested for the class that didn't make the cut? Or sorry, I should say that anyone suggested that didn't make the cut. Any hidden gems that we don't know about that were almost there for warriors?
We didn't get a lot of knockback abilities. That was something we couldn't do a lot of back in the day for server reasons, essentially, tracking that stuff. Anything with mobility becomes really difficult, especially when one is pushing another, because we don't track geometry on the server, essentially. It's too expensive. So it was difficult to move things around without, featuring walls and things like that into it. So there were definitely things like that we didn't get to add that we would have loved to. Having the warrior feel like he was this powerful force that could move things around on the battlefield, swap them, and they'd go flying or whatever it was.
Docken, I'll just ask quickly now, is there anything that you sort of, I know warriors were in such an amazing spot, but is there any one little thing that you wished had made it in that you'd like to propose to Kevin?
You know, and it's maybe the fact that I've just, like I said, I've been enjoying it so much is I think like the heroic leap is so freaking fun. And maybe that's just me and like the novelty of it right now because I haven't spent an extended period of time. But I think about that and I'm like, man, there's so many times when I'm playing in vanilla. I'm like, if I had that in addition to my other tool set, like there's so many things you could do that would be really neat. Or even that was added later in, like the intervene ability would be something that could be very unique. But again, I'm on that no changes wagon. But those are two things I think are really cool and would be a lot of fun to play with. I mean, again, this might be going down like a rabbit hole or tangent that's kind of like sideways, but I'm a person that would be interested in like post-max content created in a, you know, classic capacity, but adding maybe like more modern mechanics to like the encounters and stuff just to make them a bit more dynamic. And in doing so, you could offer alternate advancement and things like that could be, quote, maybe like hero class abilities. Like you could specialize into a hero class that kind of went, instead of pyramiding upward with the scaling and the power creep, it could creep sideways.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother thing in itself. But I very much enjoy the way that the warrior plays in vanilla. But just having those things in my knowledge base, I feel like they're two things that are kind of really neat. But they do add more mobility to the warrior, which is really all that it would be.
Right. Yeah, I will say another thing about the design of all three of his movement abilities: intercept, what's the defensive one? Intervene, and charge. Were that they were all related to targets rather than free-form movement. We actually wanted to restrict his mobility to the relationship between him and the thing he was attacking or him and the thing he was saving, rather than heroic leap, which allows you to go anywhere. We felt that was a better fit mechanically for classes like the mage with blink and teleports and potentially, you know, rogues, or, you know, hunters with the disengage and things like that, where the warrior couldn't just be this hopping around guy. So that was one of the things that one of the ways we made it distinct from the other classes in his movement thing. So I was interested to see that they broke from that and went a different direction with heroic leap, letting you sort of go anywhere.
It's kind of interesting to hear the consideration of that.
Now, Kevin, I'm going to present the possible this potential hypothetical situation to you.
Right.
It's the night before Classic release, and you, for some reason, have, you know, snuck into the Blizzard office, and you've got carte blanche somehow to change anything you can with Warriors before the release of Classic. Would you change anything?
Yeah, I get asked this a fair bit. The time machine as well. Like, what would I do if I could go back? And there are probably a few things I would want to change, but I always feel strange just because, you know, WoW was very successful, and a lot of the things that we designed that we may have changed later on, you know, taken out of context, it's easier to evaluate, but within the context of how successful WoW was, it seems like I should be hesitant to change anything, if you know what I mean, because there's risk there and like, oh, I actually messed something up.
If you start to do that, you end up with that ripple effect. I feel like a lot of things in vanilla, particularly with like player versus player, and you have this rock paper scissor, you know, mentality. If you start changing that, then you start changing the dynamic between that player and other players, and you throw off the whole sequence of events. And then, you know, well, this guy needs to have this to counteract that, and then you're changing this, and that whole just spiral downward. And I think that's a lot of where the no changes comes from, is people don't want to see that happen.
Yeah, one of the things that I frequently say is how big a job it is to do class balance, because it's never in a vacuum. As you were saying, you know, like if we are going to start down a road of, well, we need to fix this thing, we need to make it so, you know, nature or boomkins are more mana efficient, right? You're going to open a whole can of worms, because that just means everything else that's slightly problematic is going to have to be looked at, which is going to create another new, like, struggling class or group of classes or specs, which then are going to have to be adjusted. So it's a huge job, and it should never be taken lightly. So, yeah, what would I change about Warriors? I don't know that I would change anything in reality. There might be, like, some weird wish list things that, like, if no one were going to play Classic, it were just one of those things where I could put it on a shelf. There might be something there, but yeah, not sure.
No, that's fine. Maybe that's the perfect answer, is they were pretty good as is. So that's all fine. Now, Kevin, we'll round out this warrior call just with a couple of listener questions, and they're both from the same listener, and I'm just going to sort of set this up. These questions are relatively long in terms of, it's one decent chunk of a paragraph, but they're pretty full on. So strap on your ears here, because you might need to pay attention during this one. And I know it's a bit full on, but I'm sure there'll be a good answer in there. So these are from listener Archeon, who says this. It seems like there was a huge disparity in power for warriors when considering them from the start of vanilla, and then comparing them against how they performed in the final stages of vanilla, being 1.12. This occurred due to a multitude of reasons, some of these being the 1.8 patch note, items which provide plus hit chance will now be allowed to counteract the increased mischance penalty of dual wielding, which significantly boosted Fury Warrior dual wields DPS potential, among other classes, and another being the progressive introduction of more optimized gear. It was mentioned previously on the show that the developers foresaw the rage system for warriors as presenting challenges down the line due to its hyperbolic nature in performance, and this became clear by the time the Nax patch rolled around. My question to you, Kevin, is, to your memory, at what point did the class feel like it hit that sweet spot, that quintessential moment which defined how warriors were meant to feel and play? Were they intended to become as strong as they did in Vanilla's final stages, or is that something that would have been on the list of love?
So, yeah, hit chance was definitely one that was troubled because of the difference between single-handed and shield, or even just one two-hander and dual wielders. It was massively more powerful in the dual wielder's hand to a point than it was in the non-dual wielder's hand. So that was one we had to be careful of. We had to balance in relation to the non-dual wielder and sort of leave the dual wielders starving for more, unfortunately. But so that was one part of that question. The other was about the rage system in general, which I've talked a fair bit about over the years. But the sweet spot, it's funny because, you know, part of the reason that the rage system and the warrior experience was so satisfying and was so great was because of the broken elements. You started at, you know, a patch cycle or a content cycle feeling really weak, but every upgrade was more valuable in terms of gameplay experience because of the rage system. And then, you know, by the end of it, you were overpowered. But again, it's like, would I consider the sweet spot sort of cutting off both ends of that experience, where it's like you weren't quite as weak coming in and you weren't quite as powerful going out? I'm not sure, just because it was part of what made the class super fun to play and to grow, more so than a lot of the other classes. So I don't know that I would like push everything towards the middle, you know, in that example. Because I think ultimately that would have made the class a little less fun. What I would hope is that the end game, the end of the cycle, didn't last very long. You know, like, yeah, they were overpowered, but you know what? Here's the new content, so you're back to square one. So sort of let you feel super powerful for a time, and then it's time to go back to the beginning and back to the basics. So anytime we had a situation where content was lasting too long, which was a problem across the game, not just for warriors, but things started to break down. So yeah, I'm not sure that I would fix that even nowadays.
Okay.
Because you can always make things more balanced, but they end up feeling more bland in a lot of cases.
Okay. Now, here's another one that we sort of touched on a little bit, but it goes into a bit more specific detail. Their next question, and we'll leave this as the last question, is, in patch 1.11, the ability Shield Slam received a redesign quoted as, "This ability has received a redesign. It now costs 20 rage to use, and the damage it does is modified by your shield block value. However, the base damage has been reduced. It generates more threat per rage and more damage per rage than it did previously." This patch simultaneously, as you're aware, was also the patch Shadow of the Necropolis and heralded the release of Naxxramas. The spell redesign obviously granted warriors far higher threat generation per second, and this in turn allowed raiders to push their DPS to a far greater extent. To your knowledge, if you can remember, was this spell redesign specifically implemented to help raiders better compete against the challenges awaiting them inside Naxxramas? And in your opinion, as an original developer, would it be a good idea to see this implemented at the launch of Classic? You know, for example, going into MC and Oni, allowing raiders to do far higher DPS and threat?
That's another great question. So some of the reasons why that might have been changed, I can't remember specifically, and it could have been for multiple reasons. Why we changed the balance on it is because we wanted people pushing that button. There might have been a time where it wasn't worth the global cooldown in terms of threat generation to be pressed. And so it needed a redesign in terms of the math. It also could have been like it was a good ability at the start, but once you got really good gear, its threat per GCD went down. And so we wanted to make it scale better. That could have been another reason why we tweaked where the numbers were coming from. And it could have also been to help people, like you were saying, get more value from their raid DPS because of the threat could go up, with the tank's threat generation to help people get over the Nax. Those are all valid reasons of why it could have been changed. I can't remember specifically, to be honest. Do I think that should be changed for Classic? I don't. My worry for Classic bosses is that they're going to be too easy. And so I don't think that making, changes even within like the context of, if we could just change a couple of things, we should change something that makes the mobs or the bosses potentially easier. So yeah, I wouldn't change it.
Docken, you had a question about threat?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a perspective thing or just a question of curiosity. Like when you guys were designing and kind of creating the warrior itself, were things envisioned as far as like the threat generation from a dual weld Fury Warrior being a tank as kind of like a push method versus having the protection being the primary tanking tree? Or did you guys have considerations about the other tree options that people might try things like that? Or is that just something that was kind of like wasn't thought of in that way at the time?
We always were looking for outliers. We wanted the tank to be the main man in terms of tanking, especially high-end content. But we were fine with Fury Warriors tanking, lower level stuff after you sort of crushed the content and you were way over geared. I think it was fun that Fury Warriors would go into 5-man dungeons and have a good time. If you're asking more about were we considering how much damage they could do based on their threat output compared to the Prot Warriors, that was always, a major consideration.
I was going to say maybe the lack of clarity in the way that I asked the question, because it feels like you're getting close, but not quite the exact example I'm thinking of, is that one thing that people have theory crafted out, and maybe whether you are or not familiar, maybe my ignorance, whether you do or don't know, is that people will use a dual weld Fury Warrior that is the main tank through content like AQ and even parts of Nax, just because the threat generation that they have because of being able to just put out so much damage, and then they just use over-optimized healing to keep that person alive who's sitting there using Death Wish while tanking, taking massive amounts of damage, but just having insane output because of it, those kind of things.
No, we wanted tanks to ultimately be a combination of mitigation and threat, and they should have been the best at both of those things. So in terms of the Fury Warrior replacing the Prot Warrior in that respect, even in a situation with over-optimized healing, was either of what I consider to be a flaw in the healing math or a flaw in the Fury Warrior's threat generation. Probably not in the threat generation. Sorry, not the Fury Warrior's threat generation, the Prot Warrior's threat generation. I like that the threat on a well-equipped, high-performing Fury Warrior would have been through the roof, and something he had to balance compared to the threat output of the warrior, the tank. But ultimately, the Prot Warrior was supposed to be the main man in most fights as far as warriors go. And it's cool, I think, that some encounters are designed for alternate tanks. You have the Warlock tanks, you have the Rogue tanking in some cases. Those were one-offs, I think, that are fun and interesting. But in general terms, the Prot specs, the tank specs were supposed to be the main man.
Okay. I might leave it there. Docken, unless you had something mind-blowing to follow up with.
Not specifically. I'm sure I could sit here all day and talk with this gentleman just out of thoughts and theorycraft and ideas and stuff like that. But I don't know that it would all be suited to fit on.
All good, all good. We might leave it there just because we've got other classes to burn through. Okay, Kevin, we might leave it there just because we've got a bunch of other classes to get through, but thank you so much. Yeah. Docken, let me thank you again for jumping in and having my back and representing the Warriors during this call. I appreciate it as always, mate.
No problem, my friend. Anytime.
And Kevin, again, thank you so much. Everyone, head on over to Failure Analysis over at Twitch there and throw Kevin a follow and listen in and watch along with Kevin and hang out with him. He's a great watch over there at Twitch, and we'll hear from him next week on the next class.
Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, Josh here. I just want to take a quick moment to remind you that while Countdown to Classic will always be a podcast you can get for free, if you do happen to really enjoy the show and find yourself always coming back for more, then please do check out the show's Patreon page to see how you can help keep the lights on at Countdown to Classic and even vote on show content as the show continues to bring you more and more classic WoW goodness. Alternatively, if monthly subscriptions aren't your thing, you can always visit the show's tip jar over at Ko-Fi, with that link being in the show notes and on the website too. Now, let's get back to the show. Alright, it's time for another Countdown to Classic featured call, and I'm so happy to be joined by the two fine gentlemen with me on this one. And we've got a Countdown to Classic returnee, Docken. How are you, mate?
Doing pretty good, my friend. Looking forward to talking about some solid AQ information tonight, it sounds.
Absolutely. We're going to be going over everything and anything AQ40. I'm really looking forward to getting our teeth sunk into this one. And we're joined by Countdown to Classic first timer, BluePanther7. Say g'day.
Hey, how's it going? I'm glad to be here, and been listening to your show for a long time, and I love the work you do. Glad to contribute as any way I can.
Thanks so much for being here, mate. It's obviously, you know, we see all these names pop up in the Discord every now and again. People get involved in the chat. It's so great to actually put, you know, a voice to a name and chat to someone and engage. And obviously, thanks so much for being around with the show for so long. And it's so great to get listeners like you who've been around for quite some time actually getting involved in the show and getting your voices heard to the masses of listeners, which is fantastic. So thanks so much for that. But look, as we've said, we're going to be going and talking about Ahn'Qiraj, specifically AQ40. I thought about, we'll see how the call goes. Whether we touch on AQ20 will be completely dependent on time. But either way, you two are here because you've run AQ40 a bunch of times. As people will remember from my Molten Core recently, Molten Core call recently, and also the many times I've said it on the show before, I've never rated. I don't know the competitive nature of AQ40 and all that, but I have run, the one difference here is I have run through AQ40, albeit as a maxed character on retail where you one-shot everything. I did it just to see the lay of the land and to actually get up close and personal with the bosses, see where they're positioned and see what people would have gone through back in the day. Obviously, as I say, just without the actual fucking challenge portion of it. But it was good fun to actually see the lay of the land. But guys, I'll start very generally as I do when we talk about these raids, and I'll just get you guys to sort of talk about whether you actually like AQ40 or whether you despise it, because it's really one of those raids that I think, from what I read in the forums, is really divisive. Some people fucking hate AQ40. So Docken, I'll start with you. How do you feel about this place in general?
You know, it's funny you say that about how everybody says they absolutely love it or they hate it. And I remember when we first came back in here to AQ40, through the private server community, going into Ahn'Qiraj, everybody's saying, oh man, this is going to be tough. Like, it kind of has this stigma with it that it's going to be like, it's going to get expensive. It's going to be this. It's going to be like all these kind of troublesome things. And like, I felt the general consensus of like the team that I was with at the time when we first approached it, after about 15 years coming back, was like, oh, this isn't something that we're going to like a lot. But to be totally honest, having done it for a period of time, I would honestly say it's like growing on me some. Like, there's parts of it that are tedious, But the fact that I've had more experience at it in the past couple of years makes me enjoy it more than I did previously. So, I mean, I'd say I hated it, but after doing it enough, either I'm just like a little bit of pleasure out of the pain, perhaps, maybe. I don't know.
Fair enough. No, I see where you're coming from. Now, Blue Panther, if I can ask you, do you sort of resonate a lot with what Docken said, or are you very much so one side or the other? You love it or you hate it?
So that's a really good question. Now, I haven't done AQ40 for 13 years, so it might be looking back a little bit with rose-tinted glasses, but I think it was a little bit of a split. There were some really terrible parts to that instance, and there were things that people hated doing back in the day. It was awful farming for a new set of resist gear. There was a lot of new consumables that people were using. It was a lot of trash, and the trash was awful back then. That was before they had added the teleportation that they later added. So it was constantly going through the trash. But on the flip side, it had some really fun boss fights. There were a lot of really unique boss fights. They added a lot of new types of strategies or mechanics to fights that really hadn't existed in terms of their complication. And so, you know, I remember it fondly, but I wonder how much of that is just rose-tinted glasses looking back and remembering the fonder moments of the instance, because it was very tedious at the time. I do remember that.
Well, you've raised a couple of great points already, and funnily enough, they're points that actually players go through perhaps before they even get through the doors of the instance. And you raised, well, I'll set this up first and foremost. Docken, you're talking, I'm glad we've got both of you here, because as Blue Panther just said, he rated AQ back in the day. So he doesn't obviously go through it on private servers, whereas Docken, you do go through it on private servers. But Docken, did you also play it back in the day?
Yeah, I did.
So you rated AQ back then?
Yeah, I did MC, BWOCG, AQ20, AQ40, and my guild killed Instructor Vesuvius and Axe, and that was all the farther we got in vanilla, because at that point, like, TBC was coming out the following week, and that was kind of our stopping point. But I do remember doing the Cthulhu fight in Classic, but I don't remember if we actually killed him or not.
Oh, you can't remember? It's been scrubbed from the memories.
Yeah. I can't remember if we did or not. It's this black hole, man. It's that, you know, back before I started to enjoy it a little bit, I guess you just block out those painful memories, maybe.
Fair enough. Well, look, as I say, it's so great that both of you did it back in the day, and also one of you is still doing it now on private servers for that sort of comparison between the two. And obviously people do enjoy it when we get vanilla players who come on the show who were there in the trenches with us all those years ago. But the two words that you mentioned, Blue Panther, that I want to talk about, as I said, that happened perhaps before you even get to AQ40 is nature resist. And it's something that people are very much so aware of if they're going to be tackling this place, the need to have all that nature resistance gear built up, obviously particularly for the Princess Huhuran fight. Talk to us about the grind or the efforts or the, you know, painstaking motions that you went through. I'll start with you, Blue Panther, to get all that nature resist gear, and if you got much of it.
So, you know, I think it's a little bit different on private servers where you have this knowledge going in that there's going to be this instance with nature resist. Back when I played, you didn't really have the knowledge that the new raid instance was going to have this huge influx of needed nature resist. They did recently introduce the green dragons, which was a huge source of that gear. But at the time, you didn't really know that. So once you kind of, that information came out, I remember a lot of the focus was on farming those green dragons and controlling the farms and the PvP that went with that and just trying to control it on your server. I was on a server where there was about 3 or 4 equal raid groups that were kind of vying for that. And it was split in the factions. So there was a lot of competition over those because who was getting those green dragons in some ways kind of helped dictate how quickly you could progress through AQ40. So it's kind of hard to talk about preparing for that raid without talking about the green dragons as well.
Well, go for it. How'd you go with the green dragons? So you said you did a pretty good job of controlling them with your guild. Is that something that you guys sort of organized a lot, you know, did a lot of texting outside of the game going, all right, we'll camp here, we'll camp there, we'll do this, we'll do that?
It was a lot of camping. I don't know how well we controlled it, but it was pretty common that, several of the members of the guild would post like level 1 alts throughout the various spawn points. People would be logging in throughout the day, these alts just to check. As soon as one was spotted, the bat signal went up and you're trying to scramble to find 25 people that could go take it on. Or if you didn't have that many people online and weren't able to get that many, then it was like trying to ally with another guild from your faction who was also interested in going out there and doing it. And usually not one you were competing with, because you didn't want the ones you were competing with getting the gear. So it was interesting, I guess would be the way to say it. But it was also fun. Some of the fonder memories I have of World PvP had to do with those green dragons and the world boss fights.
Okay, so did you go into AQ40 for the first time with no nature resist gear, not knowing anything about it, and get destroyed?
I don't remember where we were with the nature resist gear, but we actually went into AQ40 a little bit after it came out. So we did go in armed with a little bit of knowledge of some of the boss mechanics. We were on one of those later servers, and I think our server came out about 3 months before AQ was released. So by the time we had gotten through Neff and farming all the Onyxia scale cloaks and all that kind of stuff, we were delayed just a little bit. So most of the boss mechanics were kind of known by that point, at least for those first easier bosses. So it wasn't a total unknown for us by the time we got there.
Okay. Doc, and I'll ask you, mates, obviously you're well known for being a warrior, and I'm not sure if you actually played warrior back in the day, when you were obviously running through AQ all those years ago. Were you playing a warrior?
Yeah, I was.
Okay, fantastic.
I was actually Alliance Dwarf Warrior with the same name.
Oh, well, there you go. Excellent. Well, then obviously this question pertains to you sort of now and then. And, as is being raised in Twitch chat, people talking about, Keltec 2000 is saying, that warrior life with all those different gear sets. And I guess farming a nature resist set, just a new set wasn't really all that foreign to you as a warrior, because you had your tanking set, your DPS set, your resistance set. Talk to us a bit about what it was maybe going through getting another set, either back then or now on private servers.
Yeah, I do remember back in the day there was the big push to try to get everybody to get the NR items from Maradon and Stratton and various other places that had NR pieces and getting like the Sandstalker stuff crafted eventually and like all those kind of things. Like I remember people getting those items and making a big to-do about it when the gates actually opened. Let me back that up. Because our guild was kind of in the same place where we were not in there the day of that I remember, because I always remember thinking we were just a little bit behind some of the progression curve. But at the same time, getting the NR gear and kind of going back and farming that stuff to try to get those items to get your nature resistance up. But I feel like in the private server community and having that knowledge in advance, I mean, when I'm leveling up a character, if it's anything I am ever going to need. So if I'm like 58, 59 running Strata, running wherever, and like an NR piece drops or the NR shield drops or like something that's going to be of benefit to me later on, I'm like, I need that. Like I just need it. Like you don't wait to need it. Like why would I not take it? Like if something drops in Maradon, like I think I had one of those nature resist trinkets sitting in there from when I was leveling the last time I leveled, because that'll just save me RNG in a run later. So I think having all that prepped, same thing with like the serpentine resistance rings or the other, other resistance tier rings that are 17, 18, 19 plus. If you see them drop whenever you're leveling, just take them. It'll save you time later.
Now, again, I know nothing of the raid really because I haven't really taken it down as a level 60, but I'm sitting here talking about nature resist as a clueless person because as I highlighted, the princess fight, that's what you need all the nature resist for. But I don't know, do the trash mobs actually inflict nature damage on you? Is nature resist gear needed before princess?
There's nature damage done by a lot of the mobs in there. There's a lot of poison from various mobs. There's, things like that are going to do damage. But you're not going to really be wearing your nature resist on the trash. That's the kind maybe people did back in the day, perhaps, right. Or maybe you would tell your hunters, like, put up your NR aura, or maybe shaman would drop their poison cleanse totem every time the volley of poison goes out or what have you. But I wouldn't say that it's substantive enough. at least how it's scripted in the content that I'm freshly familiar with, that you would wanting to be wear nature resist for the trash. But another thing too, you're going to wear that nature resist for Viscidus because of his mechanics and the way he functions as well. So not only Hoo-Hoo, but Viscidus. And then the thing is, you're not really going to be putting on large quantities of nature resist gear for anything else in there that I can think of right now.
I think one of the things, unlike fire resist gear that you used previously, you tended to not use nature resist gear that didn't have other quality stats on it. So it's not like you were using the green of nature resist, like you were in, say, Molten Core with the fire resist gear. You needed to have that damage to be able to actually do the fights as well.
Some of that is, I get what you're saying with that, Blue. The other thing too is like some of that now it matters, but it does not matter as much because the optimization is much greater now, I think, with people's like healing specs and damage specs and stuff like that, where essentially for the Hoo-Huron fight as an example, all of your damage comes from your ranged. The soakers, they don't contribute a large portion of the damage done. And for Viscidus, the way the damage is dealt is by essentially everyone uses engineering with sapper charges and AoE, and they use crystal charges if they don't have one of those other two options. And you try to time 39 to 40 people or 35 to 40 people, as many as you can possibly get to AoE at one time, and you basically kill him in one shatter. So the damage comes from a separate source there as well.
Yeah, honestly, so in preparation for this call, I actually went back and watched a speed run on a private server, just kind of refresh my memory. And that was the one thing that kind of made me take a step back, is when I saw them do Viscidus and they did that strategy. And I was like, that's the first time I've seen that.
200 IQ.
It's one of those ones where you see it on the private server and you're like, that's something that I don't think anyone would have tried the live vanilla server, just because it's so different.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's striking a chord in my memory to think of. I remember that they would be like, they'd have groups or certain people like, you go this corner, like you go this corner, and you kill like one or two of the little shattered pieces whenever it spawns, and they would try to split the melee up to quickly kill some of him before it recollected in the middle versus the AoE method.
Yeah, and when I saw that, I don't think they ever planned on someone doing it that way.
Well, and as Celtic's pointing out in chat now, is that the case that that's become the standard strategy these days with all the information we've got out there, in his words?
Engineering, in my opinion, is one of the most amazing professions to have. If you are a melee in Classic, if you're not engineering, my opinion is you're probably doing. If you're going to be a PvE, like pressing to the optimized.
Now, just quickly, we've obviously mentioned Viscidus a few times. Now, is it right that Viscidus is an optional boss?
Yes, you do not have to do it.
Okay, well, keeping that in mind, knowing what we've talked about, and again, I'm like a dog with a bone with this nature resist thing because it's a really interesting concept to me. How did you feel as hardcore raiders, knowing that perhaps for Classic, if you want to take down Princess as optimally or as quickly as possible, you should probably have a fair few of these nature resist items on you? How do you feel about that, knowing how Blizzard implemented that into the game? Is it a fun wrinkle that there's this one fight and perhaps only one fight, as Docken pointed out? You don't really need it for the trash. You just need it for Princess and if you take on the optional boss of Viscidus. How do you feel about one encounter needing all this nature resist gear to progress in the game? Is it a fun wrinkle or is it a really odd gatekeeping tool brought in by Blizzard? How do you guys feel about that?
I personally feel like those are really, really great concepts within games because it adds a different dynamic to what you need to do in preparation, to the way the fight works, to it kind of changes your traditional approach of like, all right, all the rogues stand in the back, all the DPS warriors stand behind that, the tanks in the front, and everybody, the casters just line up in the corner and attack. And like, that's it. Like, so now you're like, all right, well, what do we need to do? And not just like, it's not just the nature of this because there's a tank swap mechanic with Princess. There's threat understanding with Princess, to go through the whole fight in a certain way. So what you're doing by stacking the soakers and having the 15 people that are going to take the AoE damage when seeing rages, in what you're doing is you're giving yourself okay, well, we're loading these guys up as basically a bunch of duds. They're not going to count for much of anything during the fight. All they need to do is stand there and stay alive. And you're putting more weight on other people within the raid to do things to make sure that the boss dies in an effective manner. And I think that by adding that stuff, especially when it's not already known, when you're progressing through some type of content in any MMO, I think it's kind of neat to go into a new encounter and you're looking at, well, what is this? Like, oh my God, there's so much damage. There's so much, this and that. What do we have to do? How do we overcome this? And then you're like, well, let's get nature resist. And then, you start realizing like how to go about doing the fight. Another kind of comical example to speaking to some of the optimization that exists now, and this is kind of leapfrogging into another raid, but I was watching old videos of Nax, and I was looking at a group doing Thaddeus, and Thaddeus is a boss that does a lot of nature damage, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, why in God's name do they have it was like 6 or 7 hunters in the raid group? And I was like, oh my God, they're using the nature resist aura. And it's just changing the approach of the fight by adding something like that, which I just thought it was neat. And I mean, I think it's a neat mechanic to have things like that built into instances. It's not necessarily a full stop, but it may be a speed bump for progression for people depending upon what it is.
Yeah, it never really felt out of place back in the day. Back when vanilla was vanilla, resist gear was part of the game, and it always felt weird that they didn't use more of it other than the fire gear. So when they started using the nature resist, I don't think it felt out of place. I think it fit the theme of raiding at the time. I think the more annoying part was just that there wasn't a lot of good nature resist until they kind of retconned some of the pieces and then also, put in some higher end nature resist and the stuff that you got from within the instance itself.
Okay. Now, I firstly want to say thank you very much, Blue, because you mentioned earlier that you were watching videos in preparation for this call, and I love when callers do their homework before a countdown call, so thank you so much for that. I want to just slightly go into another topic that is, relatively popular when we talk about Anchorage, which is the Karaji battle tanks. Before we can sort of get through all the encounters, let's just quickly talk about this one thing that obviously a lot of people yearn for when they step through the gates of Anchorage. Did either of you guys happen to, obviously you might have gotten your battle tanks. Did you get the red one?
Blue's my favorite color, and red is probably my second favorite color, so I'm always a fan of the blue one. I got the first one that dropped for our previous run through. They're like, we'll give them to the tanks and healers first, and then we'll give them to the DPS after that. And it was the first one that dropped us green, and now they're just kind of rotting whenever we kill the trash. And I'm like, can I get a blue one? And they got it to me just because I like that. But I think it's kind of a neat quip that they added, just something a little different, and also with the sheer size of that instance, I think it was a nice way to add a increased rate of travel without making it just mounting up on your horse and running through the tunnels.
Yeah, I don't remember which color mine was. All I know is it wasn't black. But I do remember thinking at the time that it felt a little bit like they were trying to cover up the size of the instance by adding it. It felt like to me like they had kind of added it as an afterthought. Like they got done with the raid, the instance, and they kind of did a playthrough, and they're like, oh crap, this place is too big. It's going to take way too long to run through it. What do we do? And then the mounts were added. But it's also like one of the neatest quirks about the instance as well. It's a cool addition.
It's one of the quirks that puzzles me about the community, to be honest. Now, please understand when I say this, I am the opposite of a cosmetic fan. I don't give a shit about collecting cosmetic features in games. I don't get involved in microtransactions. I don't buy different skins. I don't participate in any of that stuff. Whatever sort of the game gives me by default, I'm happy with. I don't really care about changing my appearance that much. When you have haircut options in games even, I'm like, I don't need to cut my hair.
I can support that.
Yeah, it just doesn't really interest me.
I heard someone eloquently say that, your transmog is the gear that you currently have, and that's what makes you feel cool.
Yeah.
Not the way you look because you farmed something.
No, I agree. But we talk about these Karaji battle tanks, and I really have to admit that, sort of learning that everyone was clamoring for this red one. Okay, yeah, it dropped the least of the ones that were available, but that's what made it so desirable. just the fact that it had, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong here, but the fact that it had a lower drop rate, people were like, oh my God, I've got to get me one of those. But you could get them in other colors. So I'm like, what does it matter? I just don't understand sometimes the collector's mindset. I mean, I do and I don't, if that makes sense. How do you guys feel about it?
Well, back in vanilla WoW, the way you looked said a lot about how you played the game and where you were in terms of progression. And so I think it played a much bigger role back then. Even by the time we got to Burning Crusade, that had changed quite a bit. Where, I mean, you could be in like a raid set of blues and you'd look like this badass. But back then, like, you looked like a scrub if you weren't in some sort of high-end raid gear because it was just generic templates. So the way you looked mattered, and I think that kind of drove that obsession with trying to stand out in some way, even if it was just a mount.
The thing with the mounts, and again, it falls into that same like anti-cash shop and anti-pay-to-win type of thing, where having something is really cool if it's unique, but if everybody has it, it's not unique, and now it's not cool anymore.
Fair enough.
The Zolian Tiger is awesome because very few people had it back in the day. It's a cool looking tiger model, particularly on Horde side, because you didn't have tigers at all. So if you had that, you looked awesome. You're like, oh my God, he's got a Swift Zolian Tiger. But now you walk in there and you're like, I don't even know what the hell mount that is, because there's like 700 mounts available. You know, it just it takes away from it. It's just everything is special, nothing is special.
Yeah, no, I totally see where you're coming from there. I guess I'm happy to be in the minority here. I am the weirdo who's like, I don't particularly lust after the Swift Zolian Tiger or the Raptor mount because I'm like, I've got something, my trusty little horse or whatever it fucking might be right here that gets me from A to B in the same fashion. So it just never really lit that fire underneath me. But as I say, I'm completely aware that a lot of people will be listening to this like going, Josh, you're crazy. Like, I've got to get me one of those. But on the battle tank, I'm just more, interested more in the mindset of you two. Whereas, let's say hypothetically you play Classic and you get your blue or yellow battle tank. Are you going to run AQ 20 more times to go for the red?
I think no. Like, I don't care. I mean, I'm considering going for the legendary mount when it comes out, depending upon the status of the server and certain other things. Like, I think that would be cool because now you've got something that's basically the limited time availability. It was overwhelmingly challenging to earn, and you did a lot of things to get it. So you basically earned the item. It wasn't just you got it. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't run multiple times on account of getting a mount. If it was like, here, I got the green one that I got, and I can't get another one because it's unique and it won't drop for you ever again, I don't care. I'll just ride the green one.
So I'll show my ignorance here. What was the legendary mount?
I can't remember what the heck it's called, but I guess it's like it's the black one that you can ride in the open world. That's part of the gate opening.
Right. Yeah.
I would never be going there just for those mounts, simply because you can only use them in there. I would note that you do go back to AQ40 quite a bit. When you said 20 times, you probably go there 20 times just farming Cthulhu to get everybody the gear that they want. So you would be going back there. I remember by the time we were done, those things were rotting left and right because I think most people had multiples and weren't looking for more.
Guys, let's get into, obviously some of the encounters. Let's talk about the meaty stuff now, what we're going to take down when we're in Ahn'Qiraj. And the first thing that we're going to see is obviously a relatively famous topic or infamous topic in terms of that AQ40 trash. Talk to me about why people bitch and moan so much about the amount of AQ trash that you find spread throughout this instance.
You kind of said it. It's the amount.
Yeah.
There was a lot of it, and it took a lot of time. And I think that's kind of the thing. Coming from Blackwing Lair, which is the most recent one, they had cut out a lot of that tedious trash. There's like a period in there where there's quite a bit, but there was a lot of just going from boss to boss to boss. And I think people had kind of gotten used to it at that point. And then to jump back to the large amounts of trash between each boss I think it just kind of rubbed people the wrong way.
Well, if you think about what trash actually exists between bosses, when you go in the gate, there's an Eradicator, then there's 4 Anubis-esques, then there's another Eradicator, then there's 4 Anubis-esques, then 1 more Eradicator. Then you have your first boss. So basically you have 5 pulls and then your first boss. And if you go to the next boss, if you were to do the Bug Family next, which is another optional boss, you're looking at another 1, 2, 3, 4, like another 4 pools, I think, maybe 5. So it's only like 4 or 5 pools there. And then if you go from the bug family to Satura, you have, I think it's 5, maybe 6. And then from Satura to Vanquish, it's a hallway that's kind of a gauntlet. So I wouldn't even call it like, it's more of like an event in my mind when you look at it. So you have that, and then from Vanquish to Visitus, there's 0 trash. Then there is probably 8 or 10 pools to Princess. That's an estimation. And after Princess, you have 5 Anubis Defenders to Emperors. After Emperors is where the trash becomes a problem, in my opinion. Because, well, the preempt trash is a pain in the butt. Those defenders are harder than Molten Core bosses, in my opinion. They are so unforgiving and they do so much damage that if you screw up, you're basically wipe. And then the trash after that has a lot of like mind controls and, mind flay that CCs people a bit and things that do a lot of AoE damage that are very hard to like keep under control unless you're kiting it. And, those things are what's tough, I think, is the trash in the latter half of the instance.
That's interesting.
I would agree with that.
It's very interesting to hear because, that was one of the questions I had of whether that sheer amount of trash was the only complaint that people had going, oh, fuck, there's just so much of it. Or if it was actually a challenge on top of the number of mobs that you would find in there. And thanks for that description, Doc. And it's really sort of intriguing to hear because obviously, again, we had the Molten Core call on the show recently and they were discussing, obviously with their guild Grizzly are raiding Molten Core and other instances so freaking often now they're taking them down, bosses down at record speed. Some are sub 30-second fights, blah, blah, blah. And to hear that some of these trash mobs are a little bit more challenging than some of those Molten Core bosses that they laugh at, like Gehennas and Shaz and what have you, that sounds like you've really actually got to be switched on. And this is not one of those instances where you can take a snooze during the trash. Would you agree with that, Blue?
I would. And actually, I went through some of the patch notes from the point that AQ is released to the end of 1.12. And there really wasn't much that was ever nerfed in AQ40. I think when Classic gets released, there will be 2 zones that feel almost identical to the way they did in True Vanilla, and that's AQ40 and Nax. I think a lot of the earlier instances are going to feel different because the towns changed so much and there was itemization changes so much that they're not going to feel like the original vanilla experience. But AQ40 will, and I think the difficulty that is kind of inherent with the difficulty of the raid and the fact that it's going to be pretty much the same, I think it's going to be one of the cooler aspects of running AQ40 and Nax when we finally get to them in Classic.
One of the things, too, is just kind of interesting about AQ40 when we're talking about the trash and how people feel about it and the mechanics that are involved with it and the difficulty of it relative to some of the bosses and things that existed previously. A discussion that kind of happened in my stream the other day, and it was a very good point, and we were talking about how hard it is or isn't and the challenge versus other content as far as the difficulty of the bosses. And the discussion basically turned up, in my mind, the consensus of it was, is I kind of formed the opinion that they are more difficult and there are more challenging aspects of it, but AQ40 as a whole is where individual responsibility of any given raider starts to manifest itself in failures or in success, in that if an individual in Molten Core doesn't decurse, someone's probably going to pick it up. If they are kind of slacking on their counterspell, someone else might take care of it. But if they're not doing what is needed or required of them, it shows up more, and it can also cause failures in the raid, or you can wipe, things like that. So that's probably one of the other reasons I think people dread AQ40 is that those individuals start to stick out more, and if they don't measure up to the individual responsibility requirements, then you're going to have problems because of it. And that goes with the trash as well, because again, the trash just before the Emperors, they have these Anubis Defenders that will Thunderclap, Meteor Strike, Shadow Volley. There's an ability called Plague, and the Plague does a AoE poison on everybody around the person that's infected. And the Shadow Volley does a massive amount of damage where if you get hit more than twice by it, you're probably going to die. So the general strategy is that the melee stack up at the feet, the casters and healers stack up a few yards back. And if it's Meteor Strike, it splits the damage among all the targets. You're in safe, okay? But it also is Thunderclap, so the casters don't want to be up there, maybe. So they are out of range of that hitting them. But the thing is, if someone gets If the shadow volley happens and everyone moves except that one guy, now that one guy is now dead. Or if it's meteor and that guy is not stacked with the group, or he's standing too far to the side and he gets meteor struck, he's now dead because he took the full damage and it didn't split. Or if they get plague and they don't run out of the group, you can kill everybody because of that. So it's like those things start to show up more based upon the encounters and the way the mechanics are, even in the trash, not just the bosses.
I would even go one step further and say it's not simply about someone else covering your responsibility. I think a lot of the fights in AQ40 are the first time where it's not as simple as somebody giving you instruction like saying, stand here, do this, this is your job, this is your responsibility. It's one of the things where you start to get a priority list of things that you need to be aware of, and you need to be able to make dynamic decisions as to which one of those things you should be directing your attention to, and which one is the most important for you to address first to benefit the raid. And that particularly comes in on those last two fights with Uro and Cthulhu.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was discussing with somebody today about raiders themselves. Is from a managerial standpoint, from a guild organizational structure, when you look at people, there's players that you understand like, okay, this guy can do certain tasks well. That task is he can cast Frostbolt, he can stand out of the fire. But he doesn't decurse well, he doesn't do this well, he's like trouble for this, trouble for that. And there's kind of like, then there's this other guy that he knows that this is why you stay out of fire, he knows this is why you dispel this, he knows this is why you stand over here. And then there's the people that know, this is why I do this is why they do that, this is why the tank stands here, this is why the person does this. So you have this person that can just do their job, person that can do their job and understands why, and a person that can do their job, understands why, and knows everybody else's job. And you start needing to know why you're doing things, and that's that prioritization like Blue's talking about, is removing that poison is so valuable because if it doesn't, it kills people. Or, doing that interrupt is so valuable because if it doesn't, everybody gets arcane explosion. And those things all tie into that, I think.
All right. Docken, I'll start with you, and then Blue, I'll get you to answer the same question. I know it is very hard to say, but if there's a way to answer it, is there any one particular class, and whether you want to divide it up between preamps and post-amps, however you do it, is there any one particular class that through AQ40 you're like, thank God they are here?
I feel like it's a challenging question to answer because
it might be everyone. Everyone gets used
what role they're filling, but generally from a standpoint of the horde side, I think that shaman are very powerful because of Viscidus is a prime example, or anything that does poison damage or does an AoE poison volley. Every time it goes out, the shaman just recasts poison cleansing totem and it will clean their entire group of poison. And that's something that the Alliance don't have, where they have to go through and either use consumable to remove it, or they have to have someone casting like abolish poison or things like that, so they can cleanse an entire group in one single spell cast instantaneously. And if you have 5-6 shaman, then you only have 10 people you actually have to cast manually cast a spell on.
I would agree with the shaman comment. I played Horde as well. And I remember we were always super butthurt over not having paladins, salvation, fear ward. And Viscidus was that first fight where it felt like Horde finally had an advantage over the Alliance. That shaman do make a huge difference. The other answer I would give is mages. I might be partial to it because I played a mage, but at least with the strategies that we used back in vanilla.
This is the rolling ignites?
Well, that and having a lot of range damage was useful for some of the fights like Cthulhu, Viscidus, and then also having like sheep available for the mind controls and the various different fights, Trash and Scarum. So I think that was a class that kind of had the ability to shine in that instance. But just about everyone was useful in their own way. All
right. Guys, let's get into our first boss. And what we're going to do now is I just want to run through each boss encounter that we're going to come up against in AQ40, and whatever tangents we go on through this conversation, so be it. But don't feel like, if something comes up that's not related to the boss that you think of, please go down that path. Happy to talk about anything. But let's start with the Prophet Scarum. Now, my understanding, again, shout me down if I'm wrong, is this is the first boss we'll come up against in AQ40. Talk to me, Docken, about some of your memories with this boss, and do you feel like this boss clearly sets a bar between BWL and AQ in terms of difficulty? When you've come from killing Neff and you walk into AQ40 and you met with Prophet Scarum, I know it's just a first boss versus, the last boss of a previous tier dungeon, but do you feel like it is a kick up the bum that, hey, this is going to be a challenge, or is it a bit of a rollover?
I feel like I remember the biggest discussion that we had about Prophet Scarum back in the day is that he was compared to Major Domo a lot from Molten Core, and that it wasn't that he was overwhelmingly difficult because of his damage output or his, he had so many ads or anything like that. It was just about a control and a placement fight, just keeping everything kind of settled and squared away and just smoothly through it. That was what I remember the biggest comparison was. So it wasn't that I don't think we went in there with a anticipation of this is going to be overwhelmingly difficult, but that we knew we needed to keep a level head and keep it under control as far as the strategies we were using, which is basically something similar to what everybody does now. So I would say that, and I also feel like I remember that it was people talking about. They said some of the guilds they couldn't do, like they couldn't maybe necessarily kill Nefarian, or they would be struggling with Chromagus or something, but they might go in to AQ40 and try to do the Prophet to just get some of the gear so that they could help themselves out in the lower tiers, because he was doable if you could functionally get the mechanics down.
Okay. Blue, did you find that you guys struggled at all, or do you remember having to roll through him at the start?
No, I remember we killed him the first night.
Okay.
I didn't think he was terribly difficult. It goes back to when people talked about this being tier 2.5, and it really did feel like that. I think the first half, this first few bosses, Scarum the Bugs, Sartura and Fankris, weren't as hard as like Nefarian was. But then once you hit Hoo-Hoo and on, it ramped up the difficulty very fast. Viscidus, Hoo-Hoo-Ron, those tend to be much harder fights. I wouldn't have rated them harder than Nefarian or like a Chromagus. Maybe like mid BWL. I'd even almost say that Razor Gore was probably a harder fight than Scarum from a technical, once you had the gear. From a technical standpoint, I don't think Scarum was terribly difficult, and it was one that a guild could step into. I remember people saying back in the day that those first few trash pulls were harder than Scarum, and I think that's probably actually true.
I wouldn't tell people, if they're not familiar, I wouldn't say underestimate him, because again, with a lot of fights, they can go sideways very quickly. There are mechanics, there are things that can get you killed if you're not focusing on the right points when you're engaging the encounter, but yeah, it's not terribly difficult once you understand what you're doing, but it can still wipe you.
And I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who's already killed Variant, not somebody who literally just stepping into Blackwing Lair.
No, absolutely.
All right, guys. Now, looking at the loot table for the Prophet. Now, Blue, just remind me, sorry, you probably mentioned, which class did you play in Vanilla as you were going through?
So I was a Troll Mage. For loot, I didn't loot a whole lot. AQ40. Mage itemization was a little off within AQ40 in the sense that the 8-piece tier 2 was so valuable at that time that you needed a number of pieces to justify getting rid of that tier bonus.
What was that 8-piece tier bonus at tier 2 for mages?
It was Netherwind Focus. What it would do is, I believe it was 10% of your cast would proc and instacast. So it basically cut your casting time down by 5% or something like that, which was a significant number when you did the theory crafting. I know that
super fun, I hear.
It is. It's very fun, especially when you're fire. So a lot of the mage gear in AQ40 tended to go to mages who didn't have enough tier pieces, or some of the really nice stuff like the rings and the trinkets and stuff like that was kind of the stuff that mages would go for. It was also, I think, was it warriors that had a lot of gear in there? I believe?
I was going to say,
especially for DPS. The itemization in AQ40 was very different than Blackwing Lair as well. In terms, it was much more focused on damage and crit than a lot of the gear previously was. So it was very good for things like PvP, Fury Warriors, anybody who was dealing damage as an off-spec. It was very useful for that type of thing.
And Doc and Blue raises a really good point, because sitting here looking at this loot table for the Prophet, it does look like there's a number of items here that any kind of warrior, whether you're a tank or, rolling DPS, would be salivating over. Is it something that you look forward to?
The biggest items that stand out to me from the Prophet, as far as from like a warrior perspective, would be the Breastplate of Annihilation is massive for DPS, and the Cloak of Concentrated Hate is the one. I think it's got hit and some decent stats on it. Although I think some of that depends on your current hit rating and whether you have the cloak from Blackwing Lair and on how many rogues want it needed. Now, there's some debate about the other cloak, but I think I'd be happy to have both of those, as well as if you have the armaments, which you can't turn in right away, but those you turn in and you can get a very nice axe for orcs and stuff like that, I think too. So those would be like the highlights there. And as far as any NR items go, the distribution for NR items usually just go by, okay, does this have nature resist on it? Yes. Who's going to benefit the most? That's a person who absorbs on Huron. And that's where you just look at is it stamina and NR. Awesome. Like the neck right there, Amulet of Foul Warning is attack power, I think stamina and nature resist. And that's something that would just go to a soaker, preferably like a rogue or warrior, just simply so that they could do a little bit more with what they have.
Now we're getting a comment from a listener, I Toast Your Oats in Twitch chat, who's adding, sort of just layering on that AQ added that tons of plus hit gear for melee, which was big in general, and you'd be down with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of nice items in there for melee as you go throughout the instance. I mean, there are some tanking items, like I'm looking at the neck piece there, but it doesn't offer quite as much mitigation as like Medallion of Steadfast Might from MC, but it's got some okay stats, so it's like a somewhere in the middle piece. If you didn't have something better, it would definitely be. It can help you catch up if you're a DPS warrior trying to get a couple of tank items. You can get some stuff that the main tanks aren't necessarily going to want because in an optimized way, they're not better for certain tasks.
I could have added with regards to the hit thing. If I remember correctly, when AQ40 was released was kind of around the time people were starting to realize the value of hit. In other words, the idea that you wanted a certain percent of hit to kind of get capped, and people were starting to understand the value of that, and that knowledge was becoming widespread among hardcore raiders. And I think a lot of this gear kind of reflects Blizzard kind of acknowledging people's desire for that stat.
All right. Guys, let's move on to something that I was very confused about when looking into putting this call together. I've not heard of these sort of, I guess, mini bosses. I don't know if they're optional or not. Tell me if I'm going crazy, but I'm sitting here staring at Vem, Yauj, and Kree, and I've not heard of these NPCs before. What can you guys tell me about them?
Well, I'll let Docken take this one because I remember doing them back in the day, but it just kind of slipped the memory because it was so unforgettable or so forgettable.
We were actually talking about this a little bit while we were hanging in the general channel before the show. But yeah, they're the bug family. Everybody affectionately refers to them as. And you kind of have the dad, the mom, and the kid. And Kree being the dad is, the male, the larger of the three NPCs. And then you have the Princess Yaj, which is like, she's a little bit smaller than him. Or excuse me, Princess. I'm getting the names mixed up, aren't I? No, Vem is a kid. Princess, you have her. She's a little smaller than him, and you have Vem is a little kid bug. And the order in which you kill them can affect the potential loot drops, and you'd have to look that up because I'm not 100% certain the exact impact that it has. But if you kill them in the easiest order, or generally considered the easiest order, by killing the dad, then you kill the princess, and then you kill the kid finally, that's the easiest order because I believe there's other effects that happen, like they'll enrage if you kill the kid first or something like that, and a few other things that make it a little bit more difficult to do. It's kind of an interesting fight. It requires, multiple tanks and multiple things happening at one time to get it all done. But it's not terribly hard to encounter, particularly if you take the easy order, which is dad, mom, then the little one.
And they're not optional, I'm guessing. Is that right?
They are optional.
They are. Sorry.
Yeah, when you enter in, you would kill Prophet. You go up through kind of like a little architecture ensemble, drop some steps, do a couple of trash packs, and it swings around down a kind of spiral to the right, and that'll take you to them, or you can swing to the left and go toward Battle Guard.
It's also interesting that they did the variable difficulty in this fight because they never went back to it until they started doing, I think it was in Wrath that they brought that back. And they kind of ended up just splitting it into heroic and stuff like that as well. But it was interesting because it looked like they were going to go this route where fights would have variable difficulties based on how you engaged it. Then they changed their mind. And I thought it was one of the really cool innovations that they had in this raid that they just never quite continued with.
And again, with the loot here, I mean, as far as like if you're looking at drops for melee, the boots of the Fallen Hero are fairly decent, but they're not quite as good as the chromatic boots. They're kind of like a mild sidestep where you're getting a little less agility, like a couple points of stamina, but they're fairly similar in that regard. And again, you have armaments, and one of the items that's kind of actually interesting. Are these the ones that drop the trinket that has the 100 nature resist?
That's or
100 resist?
The petrified scarab, which is increases your spell resistances by 100 for 1 minute. Every time a hostile spell lands on you, this bonus is reduced by 10 resistance points with a 3-minute cooldown, and you can, it's just on use.
A kind of fun fact with that item is that's an item that my understanding is it's good to give it to people that are going to potentially be your pullers or your initiators of the fight for Cthulhu because of the way the mechanics work. Having that extra 100 resist puts you maxed out. Just gives you as much as you possibly can get if you're a little short or you're not having like the proper aura for it or something, so that they can pop that on the pool and reduce the damage that they take.
Very nice. All right, guys, let's move on to Battleguard Satura. Now, any fond memories of this boss, Blue?
I hated this boss. I was a mage and I wore a cloth, so I hated this boss. I mean, that was pretty much it. It was a lot of stunning. This is a fight where it could kind of shine, and that whirlwind was just awful. You really had to keep your eyes open, especially kind of early on before it was just the boss. She was very unpredictable. Docken could probably remember, or would probably be better at talking about the actual mechanics. But yeah, I just remember the stunning and the death whenever she got anywhere near the clothies.
I mean, that's definitely a big part of it is getting the stuns down. It's a huge portion of the fight because they're not really, quote, tankable. They essentially, as I affectionately refer to them as the lawnmower boss, where it's just they're spinning around like crazy madmen out of control. And the only opportunity you have to do anything about it is between the, quote, whirlwind effect, where there's about 4 to 5 seconds and you can stun. And the idea being is you want to stun with your strongest stun, hammer of justice, concussion blow, 5-point kidney shots, like those kind of things, so that you can maximize the time it's standing still. And that's when you burst on them as hard as you can, run out, wait till the next opportunity to stun, burst them, run out, that kind of thing. Now,
I just ask, is there a reason in particular that you can think of why this sort of boss doesn't really jump to mind for me? When I was thinking of the bosses in AQ40 in preparation for this call, I come across Battleguard Satura, and I was like, this one doesn't sort of ring a bell in all the reading I've done over the last, year specifically for the show, and also anything before that. And again, it doesn't help that I haven't been in AQ, but do you find that this is one of the least talked about encounters or least cared about encounters in AQ40?
I don't know. I mean, I never really, I don't recall people saying like, oh, we got Satura, everybody get ready, watch the video, know the strategy, make sure you do this. And I don't remember a whole lot of that because the fight's generally just like, run away from it when it's spinning and DPS when you're not getting chopped up. Maybe use a lip, lip being a limited invulnerability potion, and then just collect the loot. It was not something that was overly difficult. If you get there, you just run around in circles and damage it is basically all it is. It's not terribly difficult, I don't feel.
Fair enough.
The only thing I would say
on her.
Yeah, that's true too. As I would say is it's just important to kill one of the 3 ads as quick as you can and to get the next one down promptly. And then when there's 1 or 2 of them up, it's not really a big.
All right. Staring at that loot table, Blue, from a caster's perspective, anything that you're really, really cherishing here?
Not a lot. I remember robes of the Battle Guard some people would take. You had some nature resist gear. There was the offhand wasn't terrible, but it wasn't, like I said, a lot of the good caster loot came later on in instance.
All right. How about for the melee, Docken?
The gauntlets of steadfast determination are pretty solid. The biggest thing you're probably going to be transitioning from your gloves of might, which are 1% hit, which is why you wear them so long, to gauntlets of steadfast determination. The reason being is this are all stats. You have 20 stamina, 19 strength, 18 agility, and if you put 15 agility on there, that's substantial. That's 20 agility for a tank is 1 dodge, so you're getting over a dodge, and then 0.6 or 0.75 something. You're getting a substantial amount of dodge. You're also getting a decent amount of attack power, and they've got good stamina, good armor class. They're just a solid item, other than the fact you lose a hit from it. The next valuable item I would see for melee would be the Badge of the Swarm Guard, which is a armor reduction trinket that's very strong. Armor reduction is always really strong for melee. Those are the 2 big things I'd say you'd pull out of here for tanks or melee DPS. And the Swarm Guard is actually I think rogues, warriors, and hunters even want that, I believe.
All right. Let's move on to Thancred the Unyielding. You know, sure, AQ40 is a challenge, but things don't really get interesting until you kind of hit Thancred. And let me know if I've gotten that wrong, but that's the vibe I've gotten so far. So once you get to this point, do you feel like AQ40 very much so has a shift? It's hit that gear shift in difficulty.
I think it's after Thancred that it
after
up.
Thancred. Got you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I remember the hallway being more of a problem than the boss himself in the past, and that was just simply some of that was like not knowing to use engineering shields, like people not stacking well, like that kind of thing. Which now the hallway is less difficult. I mean, you move through it, maybe a couple of people that AOE to really die, but once you get to him, it's not terribly challenging. I don't feel.
Definitely is one of the easiest fights in the raid. It's really just a classic tank and spank, and then there's ads he spawns will enrage and one-shot people. But, I mean, if your raid's paying attention, it's pretty easy to pick those up really quickly and kill them, stun them, and down them before they become a problem.
There's a little more to it than there's tank swapping back and forth between two tanks, and then you have, like you said, the worms, making sure you're picking up and stunning. He does also periodically teleport people to one of the 3 points where he summons the regular ads from, which there's just kind of like little scarabee looking bugs that come out that need to be off tank during the fight. And then the worms are the key to focus on just getting those stunned. As he said, after a few seconds they enrage and they'll one shot a, 8,000 health tank with a, 10k armor, just boom, and you'll be dead.
Well, you've talked about tank swapping. Well, you've mentioned it a few times now through a few of these encounters. Is this sort of the instance where either you first got introduced to the concept of regular tank swapping, or is it just the place where it really had to become a thing? Talk to us a little bit about that concept of needing to really rely on sort of chopping and changing between your main tank and your off tank here, Docken.
When you're setting up for this fight, it does require the tank switching between the two tanks that are tanking him. However, that is actually not the main output of damage. The main output of damage is the ads that are coming in during the fight. So when we go in, we actually put two of our quote lesser tanks on the boss, and what they do, I think it's either reduced healing or reduced armor effect that he puts on them, and they have to swap between them. Like, okay, I've got 3 stacks, taunt it off me, and it's just kind of a back and forth dropping debuffs, and that's the consensus or the general what they need to do for the quote main tanking of the boss part. But the main portion of the damage is actually coming from the ads. So that's where we have myself and another tank that he has Thunder Fury and he has a Force Reactive Disc, and I have a Thunder Fury and Force Reactive Disc, or not a Thunder Fury, I have the Force Reactive Disc with Thunder Fury is another character. So what we do is we coordinate, okay, like, hey, the first wave of ads that come, I'll pop a Sapper Charge, which is an engineering AoE damage consumable, and what that does is it hits all of them that come into like 500-700 damage. It pulls them on me. I start proccing my shield, which chain lightnings to more of them, and it helps me get them. We DPS, kill a couple of worms. All right, the next big spawn is coming, or excuse me, the way we kill them, the next big spawn's coming. When that happens, he'll do a sapper, and then they go on him, and then we DPS AoE on those, kill some worms, whatever it happens to be, and then when the next ones come, we both just kind of share picking them up accordingly. And then you hope he's dead.
Did you get much tank swapping at all in BWL?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The tank swapping question, I kind of glazed over that a little bit. You do have tank swapping throughout various other fights, even so far back as Molten Core, where you're looking at Magmadar, or not Magmadar, Golemag, excuse me, is the Golem boss from Molten Core, and he does a stacking fire, a buff that you'll take more and more damage there. And when he hits the 10% mark, I think it is, he enrages and stomps and does AoE damage. When you're not killing him quick enough, you will get too many stacks and you can get killed by that damage. Sometimes the melee actually has to run out because they get the stack as well. They reset the stack, they come back into DPS, but you have to tank switch there. That way you don't lose a tank or have them cut loose. The other thing too, you're going to be tank swapping, quote unquote tank swapping for Rag, where you have one tank standing back, one tank standing up at Rag, and if he gets punted out, the other tank needs to come in. And then on things like Domo and various other fights, sometimes tanks have to jump around and grab something. Someone went down, something's loose, someone dotted an ad. You got to pick those up, but that's just kind of more controlling. Now, when you get into Blackwing Lair, you have things like Razorgore right off the gate. He does a conflag effect on the tank, and you have to have a secondary threat on it to have him turn to you when he can flag the main tank so he doesn't go after the damage dealers and, start fire breathing and stomping on them and all kinds of terrible stuff. And then you have Veil Straz where he's got, tanks where the first one, it goes Burning Adrenaline to a random caster with mana, then it goes Burning Adrenaline to a tank, I believe, then it goes Burning Adrenaline to a random caster, then it goes Burning Adrenaline to like a tank, which would be their highest threat target. Now when they get that, they will eventually die from the effects, so you have to have a series of tanks that are threading, because he's non-tauntable, threading in succession so that you transition from one to the next. And then even on Broodlord, when you get upstairs, he's through the suppression room, he has a threat drop mechanic. So again, you have tanks that are, now Broodlord's a little bit different because there's not as plannable, or it's not as consistent, where it's like you just build threat as hard as you can, and might go to me, and then he's hitting me. He does the knockback effect. I lose some of my threat. I drop down 10k or 15, whatever it is. And the next guy could be the druid. It could be the other tank, because we use a druid in this guild. So then it goes to that guy, and then he'll get hit, and it'll drop to the next one, and I have to build back up as fast as I can and try to stay up that meter as best as possible. And then some of the drakes, there's taunts for the wing buffet. There's taunts to let debuffs drop off of each other. Cro-Magus, if you have time lapse, you will switch because of the time lapse effect, so you have a secondary threat there. If you're not an undead on Nefarian, and Horde side, because of the way the fear mechanic works and the timing that exists, a lot of times you have to have a secondary tank there, so you're switching back and forth at times on that, depending on fear and how your threat generation is. So there's a lot of tank switching that people probably don't even think about, but it is in a way tank switching.
Okay, very good. Thanks so
much.
Sorry,
I'm monologued on a soapbox.
For God's sake, never apologize for going down a deep hole, like a deep rabbit hole on an answer. I love it. It's fantastic. Now, just staring at, again, some of the loot that we see here, I've just found a couple of items that, again, to the scrub that I am, leap off the page, and I'm going like, holy shit, that seems like really, really cool. Something like Fetish of the Sand Reaver, a trinket that drops which reduces your threat by 70% for 20 seconds with a 3-minute cooldown. Now, the first thing I've thought of, and Blue, please correct me if I'm wrong, you'll know a lot better about this than I will. I immediately think of the Warlock, or maybe even the Mage, I'm not sure, but more the Warlock that might be really, really treasuring this one, because I know of the sometimes employed strat where, if you're getting maybe a boss down to sort of the lower end of its health pool, you might have the little trick where you ask the Warlock to pop his, invulnerability potion and then go ham through those final stages of the fight where they're not pulling. If they pull threat, it doesn't matter because they're invulnerable for 6 seconds and they've gone nuts. And you guys know about this one, right?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the most unique pieces to come out of A4. I don't know if it's really one that anyone would best in slot or something that is helps your DPS, but it's one of those things that there's a lot of interesting situations where you can find a use for it. And it's one of those things that as a caster you love to have in your bags for various different instances. And I'm trying to think of one right now, but I can think, as Doc mentioned, the Broodlord fight where he drops threat could be useful for something like that. It's just, it's something that you need to premeditate, but you can definitely find interesting uses for an item like that throughout the world, not simply just within raids.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. I mean, that was just the first thing I thought of, that DPS at the end of the fight would pop that and it'd be a great way to finish things off. But I completely agree. There'd be some wild and wacky ways in which to use that outside of raids as well. There's other things. Docken, I saw for obviously someone like you might stare at the barbed choker, and that neck piece seems insane.
It's a strong neck piece with the 1 crit, the 44 AP. It's the one that drops from Hakar is comparable, except for the fact that this one has 10 stamina. The one from Hakar has no stamina, so this one's better in that respect. And I think there's a couple of attack power difference on it. But it's a solid item that DPS may want if they've got enough hits, or if they're like a 2-hand warrior or something like that. Hunters may have interest in that. It's a solid item. But for instance, I'm wearing the Onyxia quest item from the head, which is the neck, Onyxia tooth pendant, I think it is, or whatever. And it's got 1 hit, 1 crit, and it's got stats in addition to that. And I don't recall exactly what those are, but I know they're respectable stats. So I'll wear that over something like the barbed choker, particularly as a tank. But a DPS warrior is someone that's looking to get their attack power up higher is going to be looking at that Barb Choker as well, because of, like Bloodthirst gets bonus damage off of the AP, and like I said, rogues and hunters would have interest as well. The Syphilis Carapace right there, the Chest Carapace, that's got nice NR on it. That's a good NR soaker item. The Pauldrons of Unrelenting are a high mitigation tanking shoulder. Those are good as well.
Let's move on and let's talk a bit more about our boy Viscidus, which we talked about earlier. As you guys said, an optional boss, do it at your own leisure. I guess I'll start with you, Blue. Even though Viscidus is optional, would you say absolutely still, like, it's almost non-optional? Like, you got to go for that loot. Just do it.
Yeah, honestly, I think Viscidus is one of the funnest fights that was in AQ40. It was a very unique fight. It had an interesting strategy. Me being a mage, the fact that I could cast Frostbolts made it more fun because that was important. But it's just a fun fight. I think it's one that I always looked forward to when we went to AQ, and I loved it. It had one of the few items I was interested in, with the one-handed caster weapon, and so I always looked forward. I would also note that like the strategy we used is very different too, which made the fight a little bit more about coordination than simply execution as well. And I think the strategy that was used on live servers is a little more fun and interactive.
We discussed that strat a bit earlier. Docken, did you have anything else to add about any fun stories or memories from Viscidus?
I would go with you again to say he's only optional in respect of you're shooting toward Cthulhu as fast as possible. I would absolutely kill him. The cool thing that comes is it's the first one where you start seeing the Karashi bindings, which are for boots or shoulders. They're the item turn-in for the actual tier 2.5 pieces, and it's the first boss you come to that's going to give you that opportunity. There's some other like decent items that he drops. The Scarab Brooch, another neat note. I kind of like that item. I played a Shaman as well, and I never ended up getting my hands on this, but the fact that it does a shield on the target absorbing damage based on the healing or what have you, with Chain Heal, you can shield multiple targets with that. It is insanely strong for Shaman.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, the one item I'm staring at, and you guys tell me why I'm wrong on this one if that's the case, because, when we were all young and stupid when it came to itemization in WoW and we didn't know anything about what stats meant what, I'll never forget back in the day, you see things like, we've obviously all learnt a lot better since, but I would see things like, 1% crit, what do I care about 1%, and then you obviously realize that things stack and you get more of those items and what have you. But I see something like Idol of Health, and I see that it reduces the casting time of your healing touch spell by 0.15 seconds. And I'm like, what do I care? Like, is that really going to be the thing that tips me over the edge?
Something like that. You're now looking at the opportunity to have an idol in that slot, which it was empty before, basically. And the 1.5 second, it's one of those things, and I'm sure you know this.
0.15.
Or 0.15, excuse me. Looking at it for it's better than nothing when you're putting something in a slot you had nothing in before. And then the other thing you're looking at it from a more mature standpoint. And that's Druid, right? Yeah, it's Druid, the idols. And I never played a Druid, but when you're looking at your heals per second, I know if you look at the 5-piece bonus for Shaman, you get a reduction in the cast time of your chain heal. And having the reduction in cast time ups your heals per second substantially over the course of a fight when you're making that change. Now, some spells, I believe, have shorter cast times when they are lower tiers, and healers do downrank frequently. So you might have a spell that could be 2 seconds and you're taking 0.15 off of it. Now you're adding, you know what I mean? You're starting to see a more substantive change in the percentage of the gain you're getting based upon the spell tier that you're casting. So you're getting something out of it.
Fantastic. No, I've no doubt there's a lot of theory crafting behind it that makes everything I said sound really silly. It's funny to see such a low figure and you go, wow.
Yeah, no, it's just one of those things again. And if you didn't have an idol before that, you now have something.
Yeah.
So it's exactly
too easy.
Well, and I think it also increases your healing potential as well. If I'm not mistaken, healing touch is what, a 3-second cast? Or is it 2.5?
I'm not sure.
I don't remember off the time, but just running some simple math, I mean, if you're talking about a 3-second cast, you're looking at almost a 5% increase in healing output over a certain period of time. In other words, the healing per second that you can do. So spells like that can be very beneficial, more so than they appear at first glance.
Okay.
In addition, if you're pushing high speed kills, everything like people like your mana pool doesn't matter how big it is. It doesn't matter that you have 10,000 mana. If the fight's over in 30 seconds because it's something that's quote farm content, and you throw in an item like that, your heals per second over the course of the fight now go.
All right. Now, finally, guys, we're at that point that I jumped the gun earlier and I said maybe we're at the part where the raid starts to get a bit more difficult, but we weren't. But now we're there with Princess. So, Blue, I'll start with you again, and let's just say, do you have any stories that again leap to the front of your mind? Did you get your ass handed to you the first time you tried Huhuran?
Yes, Huhuran was the first one, maybe with Viscidus, where you were wiping all night type thing. It was very gear dependent. A lot of people had to learn new roles. The soaking, for me as a mage, it wasn't terribly complicated because I wasn't involved in either poison removal or the soaking process. I mean, those were the people that had to kind of learn stuff. So I was just sitting there in the back DPSing all night with my flask on. But it was definitely a step up in difficulty from the prior bosses, and it is one that you sat on for a little bit before you were finally able to down her.
Docken, now do you find that still, perhaps on private servers, Huhuran is quite the challenge for the guild that might run in there with a little bit too much confidence?
I think most people are prepared for it with the nature is this. Like, it's like if you don't have the proper soakers, you don't try the fight. You just like, okay, our time is better spent going and farming nature resist gear for people that don't have it yet than it is to try it and die. You know, there's different ways to do the fight too. That like, you know, whether you're going to go one tank and try to burst it down, or you're going to go because there's a tank swapping mechanic as well, or whether you're going to swap back and forth. And the mechanic we've kind of settled on is we have a planned death. Essentially, what we do is we let one tank it as long as he can right before the AoE volley phase. And we're like, okay, all right, Docken's going to die now. He dies, switch to the off tank, and boom, the off tank is threat chasing me. And, you know, he's got no debuffs, no stacks on him, no nothing. He's coming in fresh, and I took the whole first part of the fight. So that kind of simplifies some of it. But again, I think it boils down to if you don't have the NR, you just don't try it.
I would agree. And when I say you kind of hit that wall, it's kind of that realization. And I like, again, on private servers, you kind of have that foreknowledge, but on live servers, it kind of came up on you a little bit quicker.
Staring at the loot table just quickly, guys, Huhuran seems like a healer's absolute dream. I'm staring at, obviously the gloves of the Messiah, the ring of the martyr, and obviously the wasp-hide gauntlets if you're perhaps a resto druid. But not the biggest loot table in the world, but definitely something that healers will be clamoring for. Anything that you guys wanted to comment on with the loot table there?
Definitely good healer stuff for sure. And then again, more Karaji pieces for tier.
Okie dokie. Now, let's go to the twin amps. Something that, you know, even scrubs like me are very, very aware of. I hear this, invoked all the time. Oh, the twin amps. Like, that's a crazy fight. It's, maybe you wipe a lot. Maybe you get into the concept of, and again, shout me down if I'm wrong, but this is where we get the concept of maybe some casters tanking a little bit. Was this the one with was it warlock tanks?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
I remember this was the fight that the Warlocks have been waiting for the entire time that they had been playing Classic, because their ability to tank was something that they loved and they never let you forget it. But yeah, it was, if I remember right, one of them, was it immune to magic and the other one was immune to physical or something along those lines. And so what you need to do is have a caster tank one with a ton of shadow resist gear, while a warrior tanked the other one, and you had to keep them really far apart because, and correct me if I'm wrong, didn't they share health?
If they do share health, and if they get too close to each other, they will heal.
Yes, and the heal was a pretty big deal. So you couldn't let them get close to each other.
You lose. If they heal, you lose.
Yeah. And so what you would do is, at least this is how we did it back in the day, is you'd have warriors and the rogues with the tank, with the warrior tank, dealing damage to the twin imps. You'd have the casters kind of in the middle doing ad control. I believe there was like some bugs or something that you had to deal with, and they would get really big and you'd have to kill them. And then occasionally they'd be able to maybe throw a spell on the other twin imp. And then what they would do is they would teleport, and they would both like stop, switch positions, and it was a complete aggro wipe. And so you had to be really careful during that period to not draw aggro, because then you would draw them across, and then you'd have all the melee running across the room to the other location to go do their DPS. And it was a long fight. I remember it was pretty difficult on mana back in the day. And it was one of those fights that if you did one thing wrong, it would just blow up the fight, because you could not recover from certain things.
Yeah, the biggest keys in the fight are the pull, the warlock tank, and the warrior tank positioning, and then just making sure that on the transition, people stop DPSing the imps, so there's no shadow bolts, no fireballs flying through the air when they transition, when they trade places or teleport or whatever you want to call it, and that they kill some bugs while they're waiting, and then you reestablish tanks on either side, and then you can start DPSing according to whether you're melee or whether you're caster.
A question that I sort of was thinking about asking earlier, but now that we're getting through a few more bosses, it's become more apparent. Doc, and I'll start with you on this one, is that going through all these loot tables for all of these bosses, it seems to me like maybe, perhaps, with the exception of Dark Edge of Insanity, the two-handed axe that drops from Cthulhu, I feel like there's not a famous piece of loot in AQ40 that people like always talk about, or that's so well known. Oh, fucking, you've got to go there for this one. Look at how OP this item is. Oh, baby. I just feel like, yeah, everything there is very strong, but there's not anything that really, really stands out from the crowd. Again, maybe say for Dark Edge of Insanity. Would you agree with that or not?
I think that's actually a fairly reasonable statement, because there's definitely a lot that goes with that item. You know, I mean, a lot of people, like, they remember it. And I think one of the reasons that people so distinctly remember it is the proc effect is so powerful that back in the day, people would just like, what is that? Oh my God, I can't even move. And I'm dead. Like, this is such BS. Like, it was just, that's the effect it had on people when they didn't know what it was, and it procced on them, and they're just kind of standing there wandering around while you're beating their face in. And I think that's why it sticks out. Now, I would kind of agree with that. I mean, there's items of note that are very strong, powerful, but they're not quite like the iconicness that holds.
Blue, as a caster, do you feel the same way?
Up until Cthulhu, I would agree with that. There's actually a lot of good items off Cthulhu for casters that are some of the best items in the game for casters. The belt and the ring. In fact, if I remember right, they might even be best through the end of Nax, or very close to it. They might be beat up by like some Saffron Kel'Thuzad stuff, but there's some really good stuff there. But I would agree that there's not really a lot of iconic stuff, because the loot in AQ40 was kind of, for the most part, filling in itemization gaps compared to some of the BWL loot. In other words, it wasn't significantly better. It was better, and it was better itemized. But in terms of sheer power, it wasn't, a full step above the Blackwing Lair loot. It was like just a little bit better.
I'm looking at the loot table real quick, and another thing that popped out at me, and it's not even like super strong or anything like this, kind of memery, but the tentacle trinket and the medium trinket
yes.
from the trash, those kind of stick in my mind when I'm looking at them now too, because I remember being like, what is that? Like, oh, that's so neat. Like, they were just neat things, but they were not super strong, Yeah. You're like, why there's a tentacle there?
Absolutely, yes. The Vanquish tentacle of Cthulhu, obviously another one. Yeah, the trinket that summons the tentacle for 30 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. Now, I'm being reminded, and it's a very fair point, from, again, I Toast Your Oats in chat, who's saying that, perhaps there's no famous items there from a stats perspective necessarily, but there are some really iconic looking items. The aesthetics of some of the pieces that you pull out of AQ40, especially some of the shoulders, are really, really iconic. You guys think that you can very clearly tell when someone's been through AQ40?
Oh yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the people make reference to the warrior said, well, you look like a clown now, because a lot of times you'll be wearing like this purpley red, blue looking gear, and then you might have chromatic boots on that are kind of like a reddish pink, and you're just like, what is he wearing? I mean, but at the same time, if you kind of zoom in, like it's all got that kind of like buggy kind of like the warrior helmet has some spikes on it, and it just looks like maybe like it's a bug face with big extended like mandible, like jawline type thing, and it just looks kind of neat, but at the same time you look like a clown.
It was very distinctive, and I specifically associate the warrior shoulders and helm with PvP nightmares, because you always knew that when you saw that stuff, he was going to hit you really hard.
All right, guys, let's move on to, I know I'm going to say this wrong, Uro. How do you guys say it?
Oru, I guess.
Uru, potato. Yeah, all right.
The giant worm boss.
That one. Let's talk about that for a second. Now, any particular fun things about the strat here that stood out? Did you guys struggle with this one at all? Did you find that it was a little bit of a breather before Cthulhu? Actually, no, wait, I take that back. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, wasn't there something with Uru that was like, I'm sure I've heard people say this was incredibly difficult, or am I going crazy?
You're not going crazy. So back on live, and I do remember this, you're talking very good guilds. I mean, these are guilds killing Cthulhu that never killed him, or would completely skip him. There was a lot of guilds that would kill him once and then just never bother going back because he was very difficult. I'm guessing that's probably not the case now that people understand the mechanics a little bit better. But back at that time, sometimes raid mechanics weren't always shared between some of the better guilds, and some of the mechanics weren't always super well known early on. So there was a lot of guilds that just couldn't kill him and would skip him and go do Cthulhu instead. So he had a reputation, at least back then, of being a very difficult boss. I don't think anyone thought he was more difficult than Cthulhu. There was a lot of people who didn't think that he was worth the time to do.
Docken, did you feel that it was on private servers these days something that was a challenge? Or again, in the light of revisionist history, we've learned so much that we now ho-hum slightly at Uru as opposed to what it was like back in the day?
It was interesting because we just did him the other day, down him for the first time, with the current guild that I'm in. And it's one of those things where if you don't know it, it can be a bit challenging. You know, again, with the mechanic understanding, and there's always a learning curve. But at the same time, we got there, people were tired. Like, it was late in the raid. You know, people are like, I want to go to bed. Like, we've died some. It's getting expensive. You know, you get to that kind of point. And once we got there, we died a bunch. We got him to 4% our first attempt. And then we died a bunch, various points. And it was just like, what the heck? And the next time, I think it was the following time we came back, we came in and we one-shot him. It was just like, I think everybody was tired at that point more than anything. I definitely wouldn't say he should be skipped, and I definitely think that it's important to make sure you down him.
I would agree with that. I mean, we were one of the guilds that didn't skip him. He did have decent stuff on him. I wouldn't advise skipping him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm staring at this trinket, the Jom Gabba, going like, holy shit, that really screams OP to me when it's increasing your attack power by 65 on use, and then an additional 65 every 2 seconds for 20 seconds with a 2-minute cooldown. That's fucking insane.
I don't know how strong that would be, but I picture something like that being interesting to try on farm bosses. Like, you know, when your fight's 30 seconds long and you pop it 10 seconds into the fight, so by the time you're finished, you're like maxing out on your AP would be kind of neat. But
yeah,
even the highlight for me personally is the 2.5 legs as a warrior are very strong because they have hit on them and good stats.
Wouldn't the Jom Gabba in PvP be really useful, or am I going crazy?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a real big PvPer myself.
Fair enough. Someone write into the show if I'm happy to be told that the Jom Gabba is a shithouse item and that I'm insane. I just, again, the scrub in me sees that and my filthy casual mind goes like, oh baby, get me one of those. But maybe it's a shitty item. I don't know.
I do remember rogues wanting it, but not for PvE.
Fair enough. Okay, guys, let's move on to the final big bad, our final talking point within AQ40, and that's obviously our old friend Cthulhu. This is a fight that I still really enjoy watching on YouTube. I'll go and watch videos on Cthulhu any day of the week. I think it's a really fun encounter to view from start to finish when you go, everyone's stacking up behind the wall, and then literally when you just go within line of sight of this guy, you're in trouble automatically, and then having to spread out and do what you do in that huge room. It's a very aesthetically pleasing fight. It's an interesting fight to watch people sort of, try and handle. Tell me about, and obviously we've got all the interesting wrinkles of, mathematically impossible Cthulhu pre-nerf that obviously, again, our friend Ian Hazakostas was one of the reasons why that got worked out. Talk to us about your thoughts about Cthulhu in general. Doc, and let's start with you.
Well, I mean, he's an old god, right? I mean, I'm not a big lore guy, but I feel like he should be tough as shit. And, I think he definitely is. I can only imagine the overwhelming feeling that came to people trying to figure this fight out when you first started. Like, how many times did they die or wipe before they could figure out how to enter the room without just wiping the whole raid? Like it's kind of a thing. There's a big stigma with that. Like, people knowing that you're going to get thrashed when you go there. You go to Cthulhu planning to die.
Many Bothans died in delivering this strategy.
Exactly. It's a great fight. There's a lot of really cool mechanics to it. I would argue that it is one of the most mechanically challenging fights in Classic.
I would agree with that. So I have about 250 gigabytes of vanilla World of Warcraft videos, and I was looking at them last night, and I have 4 of them of Cthulhu, and 3 of them are just guilds wiping on the entry into the room. It is definitely iconic, and I think it's something that every guild, the first time they do it, just laughs because of how much damage he puts out in such a short amount of time, and you're just sitting there thinking like, oh, and we're supposed to kill this thing?
Yeah.
But the fight itself was probably my favorite fight in all of vanilla. The instance, not necessarily, but that particular fight was a blast. It was challenging. It was very difficult. There was a lot going on. It had a lot of tense and stressful moments, especially when you're getting near your first kill and kind of starting to get them low. There's moments where things just kind of go to shit, and it's so quick that it can happen, but you hang on for so long during that you have these tense periods. And there's a lot of, and this is the fight where I said there's a lot of individual skill that comes into play. This in
Amazingly
Uro,
so, yes.
but particularly
self-awareness,
this one because
situational awareness.
Absolutely, because when there's like that separate room inside of his stomach that you get teleported to during phase 2, and I can't remember, there's like tentacles in there, and you have to kill the tentacles to weaken him. So you have to do as much damage as you can in there. However, you can't stay in too long because you get the stacking debuff that deals damage. So you deal as much damage as you can, and then you get out before you die. And so you have like personal responsibility to do whatever you can while you're in there, and then getting out still intact. And especially in phase 2, there's so much going on. There's tentacles spawning. There's those little eye stalks spawning. I think there's one other thing that spawns too. Cthulhu is dealing damage. It's just,
yeah,
it's just
little
a
eyes,
crazy
little
fight.
tentacles, the big eyes, the big tentacles that spawn during different phases.
Mm.
Yeah, and you kind of got to know what's around you and what's with. Is it worth you going over to that big tentacle to help out versus staying where you are to help with something else? And it's the whole raid kind of needs to be aware of things. And it's one of those first fights, I think, where you can't really have a lot of dead weight. Everyone kind of needs to pull their own weight, and you really do feel an accomplishment when you beat Cthulhu.
Would you describe the fight as being fun, or it's so much stress that it kind of isn't that fun?
I would say it's frustrating. And in the frustration comes that reward when you finally do succeed. And again, I'm not like jabbing at anybody or saying negative about the group of people I'm with. Like the guys in the guild I'm in right now are amazing dudes. I have a lot of fun with them. But if you haven't done it, or you haven't done it in 15 years, you just haven't done it, right? So you have to learn. And we did our first Cthulhu night the other night. And I went in and I was like, okay, I know exactly what's going to happen here. We're going to talk for an hour to 2. Like I said, like an hour to an hour and a half, we're going to talk. And then we're going to go wipe the rest of the raid. Well, they talked for 2 hours, and then we went and wiped the rest of the raid. And that's exactly what happened, and I knew it was coming, so I was mentally prepared for it. But the thing is, it's still just kind of like you got to go through the motions so everybody can see it. And once they've got it, then you can get it down. And I think it's a fun fight. I like it when you have enough people knowing what to do that you can progress through it or get it or almost get it. That makes it more fun than just like dying on the pool, get in a room, 6 people are dead. All right, the first big red one beam, whatever the crap's, the glare, whatever it is coming. and half the raid died, wipe, okay, start over, run back for 12 minutes. Like, you know, that kind of thing is just,
I was hoping you were going to drop a hard, like, Ian Hazakostas, that said, just then. Like, the guys I raid with are all amazing people. That said, they're also fucking assholes.
I actually really like them. It's the first guild that I've been in since the one I ran myself that made me kind of feel like, all right, these are like my homies. Like, I like the way they run stuff. They try to make light of things, you know. You gotta be just as happy for the guy in your group that's getting gear as you are for yourself getting gear. And you gotta have that mentality of like, all right, everybody gets one. You just effed up. Like don't scream at him. But if you do it again, we might get angry, you know?
Now, just quickly cutting back to when you entered the room, listening along in Twitch chat is Celtic, who mentioned sort of the Benny Hill theme for an encounter earlier in AQ40. And I would suggest, if anything, as you said, Blue Panther, you've got all this old footage. I mean, like a montage of guilds trying to enter Cthulhu's room to the Benny Hill theme, I think would be the better application for that theme music.
Yeah, it's possible. I don't know if I have that many to make.
But, obviously, you know, if you are lucky enough to down Cthulhu, that's fantastic. Look, I'm a bit of a masochist in this way. A small part of me would love if Blizzard actually brought into Classic pre-nerf Cthulhu, didn't say anything, and just watched these hardcore guilds smash their faces against the wall going, what the fuck? This isn't like private servers. What's going on?
As much as I'd enjoy that, I think it would be pretty apparent early on for people who killed.
Yeah.
It was unkillable.
Oh yeah, they know.
When they say unkillable, they literally meant it. I remember watching a lot of videos of it back then. They fixed it before my guild got there, but from the videos I did see, I don't think there was a way to kill him.
Well, that's the whole thing. I think I mean, I've heard a contrary opinion, but obviously we've got the famous theory crafting, again, his name being invoked a fair few times now because we're talking about Cthulhu, of Ian Hazakostas, who really crunched the numbers on this one, wrote this epic, now sort of famous post on the forums back in the day, specifically explaining why it was mathematically impossible to take down Cthulhu pre-nerf. However, I have read since that another theory crafter shot back more recently saying, I mean, and again, it's all revisionist history, but they were saying, look, you have to understand that when we talk about mathematical impossibilities with pre-nerf Cthulhu, that's also predicated on a little bit of randomness in terms of tentacle spawns, I believe, or the tentacle behavior. I think that was one of their points. I'm horribly getting this wrong, I'm sure. But they were saying that if effectively RNG went your way a little bit, then it may have been possible. It just wasn't done in the time frame that we had before the nerf was brought in. Now, that might be entirely wrong, but that is something that I have read and an interesting take that's been put out there on the web in recent times. So yeah, it could just be someone epically trolling, going like, you know, if I had a shot at it, I would have taken him down. You know, he didn't meet my guild pre-nerf. I don't know, but it was an interesting point. But flowing on from that, guys, definitely one of the more famous encounters in the game. Very quickly on the loot, we talked about the Dark Edge of Insanity already. Is there anything in particular that you guys sort of, you know, circle on your little wish list that you want when you're going after Cthulhu?
Yes, as a mage, like I said, there are some very good items. The eye stalk waist cord, the belt, I think... I can't remember if that's best in slot until you get to Saffron or Kel'Thuzad, but it's one of the best belts in the game for a DPS caster. It's 1%, or is it 1% crit and
it's
49 healing?
9 intellect, 10 stamina, 1% crit, and increases damage and healing by 41.
Yeah. Anyways, it's one of the best items in the game. The same goes for the ring that you get from the hand-in. I think it's the Eye of Cthulhu. That is the best DPS ring in the game, I think, through the whole thing. I think there's one other ring that's comparable, but you have two rings, so it's best in slot. And then I believe there were some gloves that are very good. They're hit, damage, and stamina, which is exactly the itemization you want. And by the time you're killing Cthulhu, if you're not essentially farming tier 3, those are going to be amazing for you. Those are the items where you start to want to break that tier 2 8-piece set bonus that you have.
Doc, and I'm staring at the Mark of Cthulhu and thinking that as a tank, you might be absolutely putting that on your Christmas wish list.
Yeah, that's an item that I was like sought after for quite a while and didn't have an opportunity to get. That's a great tanking mitigation necklace. The Dark Edge of Insanity, as we said, is its own node. I would love to have one to mess around with it and see if I liked it. Like, oh my god, I might be good at PvP if I had this. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of cool. The Gauntlets of Annihilation are great. And again, another little side note, when I played my Shaman, I did a lot of pugs on my Shaman. And the cloak, what is the cloak called?
Cloak of Clarity?
Cloak of Clarity. Yeah, I was with them on their first Cthulhu kill, and what they would do is they would let me roll on items, and if I beat their guys, I could get it. And like, I rolled like a 97 or something, and like they had a couple of the guys that normally would roll, then I rolled and I beat all of them, and then all of a sudden, like, there was a whole bunch of French, because they spoke French, and there was a whole bunch of French chatter in the Discord, and then talking in raid and stuff, and then all of a sudden, like, 7 more people rolled and nobody beat me, and they gave it to me, but it was kind of like, I feel bad, but I've been here for weeks helping you farm, like, you know, get to this point, but it was just kind of a neat side story.
If they were French, there would have been a lot of putain, sus ma bite, and that's for you French listeners.
Well, the thing is, I ultimately ended up helping them go into Nax, and eventually I was like, look, dude, like, stop rolling. Just loot counsel me. You guys have been fair to me, and, you know, they did a great job with it from, you know, so it was nice. It's kind of a fun story, though.
Very good, very good. Well, look, guys, I've kept you long enough. I'll just grab your final thoughts. We've talked about AQ in depth now. You've both been absolutely fantastic. If I could just sort of get our Maury Povich moment, our Jerry Springer moment, I should say, our final thoughts, and just say, with Classic coming, do you anticipate, and this is a point that comes up quite often on the show, do you anticipate that obviously the majority of the player base will struggle with AQ as Blizzard intended? Or do you think that with what we know now, this place will not be the same magically difficult place that it's always been known as back in the day?
I'd like to hear Blue's answer before I say.
That's an interesting question. I think your average player struggle with the second half unless they are the type of player that is really truly a hardcore raider or is somebody who has done the fights previously, either on live servers or even private servers. There definitely is a step up in AQ40, and I think it's one that simple knowledge isn't fixable. Like, it takes somebody who's a good player to start beating these encounters. And simply having the gear or having watched a video alone isn't going to make the difference.
I think that they're going to have trouble with it in the sense that it's going to be the hilarity of wiping over and over again on certain fights. And there may be groups that go in and they kick it off perfectly because they watched 100,000 videos and a bunch of them have done it before. But speaking again from a leadership standpoint of Vanilla Guild previously, you can tell people how to do it. You can link them videos. You can link them written guides. You can explain the fight to them. You can make them go in the room and practice. You can make this. You can make this. You can make this. You know what? When it comes time to it, there's going to be 15 people that are like, yeah, I got this. I'll figure it out. And you know what? They go in there and they die and you wipe because they didn't do it. Even though you put it right in front of them, they just didn't do it. And that's going to happen. And the thing is, people that have been on the private server communities and been in the private server scene for a while, have done some of the stuff, familiarized themselves with it. They still haven't done it, or they've done it before and they forget and they still struggle with it. So I think people that haven't done it in 15 years are going to go in there and be like, I kind of remember this and this is what the video looks like, but we still died. That's my take. But best of luck to everybody. I'm not saying that it isn't possible to do well right away, but I think people will struggle.
I agree. I think this is the point where those people who constantly bragging sometimes have all their gear and everything's best in slot. I think some of those people are going to get a little bit of a wake-up call when they get to the later parts of AQ40.
And we all look forward to those moments. And look, guys, once again, we'll wrap it up there. We obviously didn't get the time to chat about AQ20. I had a funny feeling this would happen. We've gone almost 2 hours just on AQ40. You guys have been absolutely brilliant. I can't thank you enough. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Please take this opportunity to plug whatever the hell you are wanting to plug. What are you working on? Docken, I know you are a regular streamer. Please tell people where they can find you.
Docken_TBO on YouTube and Twitch. I'm primarily on YouTube right now, but when Classic goes live, I will be going on Twitch, and I'm currently live right now. So I got to bounce over there, guys. Thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate it, dude. Your podcasts are always amazing, and Blue, it's been great speaking with you as well this evening.
Thank you so much, Doc. And you, mate, you go stream, you go do your thing. I know you've got to run. Thanks again. We'll talk to you later. Blue, please, is there anything you want to say? Even if you don't stream, even if you don't have anything to plug, anything you want to say, anything you want to get off your chest to the community?
No, there's nothing I've got. If I could plug anything, it'll be a thank you to go support Josh. I know he's got a Patreon, and I know it matters quite a bit to him to get that support. If you're going to support anything, go support him. He's been creating wonderful content for us for quite some time at a rather impressive rate. So I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks for the invite, and thanks to you and Docken for the wonderful discussion tonight.
That's very, very sweet of you, mate. Look, I really do appreciate that. And please, by all means, I truly do mean this. You are welcome back on the show whenever you like. If anything strikes you that you'd like to talk about, you just let me know and we'll get you on, okay?
I may take you up on that in the future.
Please do. Please do. Okay, we'll see you around the Discord. Thanks so much, mate.
Thank you.
And with those calls all done, that's the show for today, everyone. But be sure to tune in next week as we go over the unwritten rules of vanilla with the listeners. Kevin Jordan will also be back to discuss mages, and we'll have another call about Hunter PvP, which was fantastic, and maybe some memory lane and anger management if we have the time, hopefully. But until then, it's time for some thank yous, and a big thank you as always to these patrons: Aero PC, Anti, Cascade, Connor C, Damien A, David F, Eric L, Hurlbert, James S, Jamie S, John HC, Minoru, Randall H, Rarebit, Rick S, Ryan K, Schmige, Sylvia K, Tim B, Tim S, Voiquora, and Zudamos. And of course, the very dedicated patrons of Countdown to Classic. An extra special shout out and thank you from the bottom of my heart to the following people: Billy C, Firespittin' Kitten, Flosy B, Carl W, Nick B, Palfurus, Romani, Tsunami, The Anton, Wilson Ma, and Volako. You all know that you really do help keep the lights on here at Countdown to Classic. Thank you so much, every one of you, for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be bringing you the content that you just heard in this episode, which I hope you love, each week if we didn't have your support. So thank you for that. That's it for today. Have a great rest of the week, everyone. I'll see you all next time.